Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. It was a damp, chilly afternoon in early November 2021 when I pulled into the empty parking lot of Pinecrest Conservation Area. Located on the outskirts of town, Pinecrest was a tranquil, wooded preserve, popular with hikers, birdwatchers, and nature lovers. I'd been coming here regularly over the past year to walk the trails and find some much-needed solitude away from the bustle of the city. At 28 years old, I craved these moments of isolation to recharge from my stressful job as a software engineer. I intentionally visited during off-peak hours, especially on dreary days like this one, to have the forest all to myself. There was something deeply calming about wandering amongst the towering pines, with only the patter of raindrops and rustle of wildlife as my companions. As I zipped up my raincoat and started down the muddy trail, I spotted a dirty blue pickup truck parked crookedly at the far end of the lot. A middle-aged man sat inside, steam from his coffee fogging up the windows. We made brief eye contact as I passed, an uneasy feeling stirring in my gut, but I brushed it off. This was a safe area. There were hidden cameras. No need to be paranoid. 10 minutes into my hike, I veered off the main path towards a dense plantation of red pines. I'd been venturing into this grove recently to practice my orienteering skills with a new compass and map. The uniform rows of trees made for an ideal spot to test myself before tackling more challenging terrain. I was halfway to my first landmark, focused intently on my bearings, when a sound made me freeze. Footsteps crunched through the undergrowth behind me, far too close for comfort. Heart pounding, I slowly turned around. There, emerging from the trees, was the man from the blue pickup truck. Up close, I could see he was likely in his mid-50s, with a doughy, unshaven face and cold, sharp eyes that locked onto me. He wore a stained beige cardigan and ill-fitting slacks. Everything about his presence felt off in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Unease skittered down my spine as he stepped closer, never breaking eye contact. I tried to stay calm, act natural, pretending to consult my compass as if I hadn't noticed him. But his gaze burned into the back of my skull. Out here in the middle of the woods, far from help, every instinct screamed that something was very wrong. Moving as nonchalantly as possible, I angled back towards the main trail, keeping him in my peripheral vision. He followed, not even bothering to hide it, always staying about 20 paces behind. My pulse raced as I hurried down the path, desperate to put distance between us. It was only when I finally reached the parking lot, dashing to my car with trembling hands, that I dared to look back again. He stood at the trailhead, openly staring with an unreadable expression as I peeled out onto the main road. I watched him the whole way, unnerved when he didn't get into his own vehicle. With shaky breaths, I sped towards home, trying to convince myself it was all just an overreaction. But deep in my bones, I knew the truth. The man in the woods was following me, and something told me this wouldn't be the last I'd see of him. Weeks passed, and the memory of that unsettling November encounter gradually faded into the background of my mind. Work stress, holiday plans, and the mundane routines of daily life helped push the incident aside. I even went back to Pinecrest once in early December, against my better judgment, just to prove to myself that I was overreacting. The trip was blissfully uneventful, with no sign of the man in the blue pickup truck. Still, I couldn't quite shake the lingering sense of disquiet that had seeded itself that dreary afternoon. It bled into my dreams occasionally, visions of being lost deep in the woods, disoriented and panicked, with the snap of twigs and muted footfalls always at my back. I'd jerk awake in a cold sweat, pulse pounding, scanning the shadows of my bedroom warily before reality reasserted itself. By the time January arrived, I decided I was being ridiculous, jumping at shadows and letting one strange encounter scare me away from my beloved nature walks. That wasn't me. I refused to cower in fear over what was probably just some socially awkward hiking enthusiast. So, on a chilly Sunday morning, I bundled up in warm layers, filled a thermos with coffee, and headed to Pinecrest with renewed determination. There had been reports of a snowy owl sighting in the pine plantation recently. As an avid bird watcher, the chance to glimpse such a majestic creature was too tempting to pass up. The parking lot was empty when I arrived, a light snowfall dusting the asphalt. I noted with relief that there was no sign of the blue pickup. Letting out a cloudy breath, I grabbed my binoculars and set out along the trail, enjoying the serene crunch of fresh powder underfoot. 20 minutes later, I reached the familiar red pines, their evergreen boughs heavy with clumps of snow. I slowed my pace to a crawl, scanning the upper branches intently. Snowy owls were notoriously well camouflaged. It would take a keen eye and a lot of patience to spot one. Just as I was raising my binoculars towards a suspicious lump on a high bough, a sound made my blood turn to ice in my veins. The crunch of approaching footsteps, clumsy and heavy against the snow. No, it couldn't be. Not here, not again. I stood frozen, heart in my throat, as a figure emerged from the trees to my left. Even bundled in a dark green parka, I recognized the lumbering gait and posture instantly. It was him, the man from the woods. He met my horrified gaze with cold, glittering eyes, lips curling in a smile completely devoid of warmth. In his gloved hands, he carried a length of thin rope, partially coiled, its end dragging across the snow behind him. I didn't wait for him to speak. Adrenaline exploded through my system, and I bolted, blindly crashing back through the pines the way I had come. Branches whipped at my face, and I slipped on the icy ground, barely catching myself. The heavy tread of his footsteps followed close behind. "Hey!" he called, voice chillingly casual. "What's the rush?" "I just want to talk." I ran faster, breath sawing painfully in my lungs, legs burning with effort. The trail finally came back into view, and I sprinted towards it, no longer caring about acting natural. Behind me, his voice rose into a shout. "Stop!" I said, "I just want to talk, you bitch." The naked rage in his tone sent a bolt of pure terror down my spine. I reached the main path and ran wildly towards the parking lot, hurling myself around a corner only to collide hard with another hiker coming from the opposite direction. We both went down in a tangle of limbs, hitting the ground with a solid thud. Winded, I looked up into the startled face of a man who appeared to be in his 60s, with a salt and pepper beard and kind blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Are you all right?" he asked, slowly getting to his feet and extending a hand. "Quite a tumble there." I ignored the offered hand, scrambling up on my own and casting a terrified glance over my shoulder. The woods behind me were still and silent, not a trace of my pursuer. "Please," I gasped out, "you have to help me. There's a man. He was chasing me." I trailed off, realizing how crazy I sounded. But to my surprise, the older hiker's face immediately turned serious. "The man in the green coat?" he asked quietly. "Heavy-set beard carrying a rope?" I stared at him in shock, a hysterical laugh threatening to spill out. "You saw him too?" "Oh, thank God, I thought I was losing my mind." The hiker glanced around warily, then lowered his voice. "Listen to me carefully. When I came up the trail a few minutes ago, I passed him at the outskirts of the pine grove. He was standing very still, watching the trees. Watching for you, I suspect." An involuntary shudder rippled through me. The man continued grimly. "I've been coming to these woods for over a decade. I know a predator when I see one." "You're in danger, miss." "And I think he'll be coming back to the lot soon, when he realizes you gave him the slip. We need to go now." Wordlessly, I let the man guide me quickly down the path, rubber legs barely keeping me upright. His hand rested protectively on my elbow, a talisman against the horror waiting somewhere in the trees behind us. When we reached the parking area, I darted to my car, fumbling for my keys with numb fingers. The hiker paused, looking back at the trail, before turning to me. "Get in, lock the doors, don't stop for anything. And miss, I'd strongly suggest not coming back to these woods alone again. There's something very wrong here. I'm going to the police. I suggest you do the same." I watched him stride to a nearby sedan, not letting myself breathe until he had driven safely out of the lot. Then, with a dry sob, I jammed my key into the ignition and raced out onto the main road, watching my rearview mirror the entire way home. The police were kind, but maddeningly ineffective when I filed my report that evening. Without a clear description of the man or proof of an actual crime, there was little they could do except advise me to be vigilant and let them know if any further incidents occurred. They assured me they would send extra patrols by the Pinecrest parking lot, but the officers' tones suggested they thought I was overreacting to a random weirdo rather than dealing with a genuine threat. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning as the day's events replayed themselves in lurid detail every time I closed my eyes. The cold malice in the man's gaze, the sound of his footsteps crunching closer, the casual way he carried that awful rope, it made bile rise in my throat. And what if the other hiker hadn't shown up when he did? Would I have gotten away? Or would I be... I cut that thought off sharply, hugging a pillow to my chest and staring hollow-eyed at the ceiling. As much as I hated to admit it, the incident had deeply shaken my sense of independence and security. How arrogant I'd been, blithely wandering isolated trails alone, assuming nothing truly bad could happen in a public park in broad daylight. I thought of all the true crime stories I'd binged, the cases of women stalked and terrorized, and shuddered. I'd been lucky, so unbelievably lucky. Over the next 2 weeks, I grappled with a near-constant state of anxious hypervigilance. I jumped at every unexpected sound, checked my locks compulsively, and started varying my routes to and from work each day. When walking to my car after dark, I clutched my keys between white-knuckled fingers, always checking the back seat before getting in. Sleep remained elusive, and when it did come, it was fitful and plagued with nightmares. The rational part of my mind insisted I was being paranoid. There had been no further sign of the man since that day in the woods. No suspicious vehicles outside my house, no unsettling encounters around town. Slowly, incrementally, I began to relax fractionally. Then the letter arrived. It was a plain white envelope, unremarkable except for the fact that it was addressed to me, but not to my house. The address was for Pinecrest Conservation Area, with my name printed neatly above it. There was no return address. My hands shook as I stood in the lobby of my apartment building, staring down at the innocuous rectangle of paper. It couldn't be from him. It was impossible, wasn't it? I don't remember deciding to open it. One moment the envelope was sealed, the next, I was unfolding a single sheet of lined paper, heart pounding behind my ribcage. The message was brief, written in a neat masculine hand. I missed you on the trail today. The woods are lonely without you. Come back soon, I'll be waiting. I want to show you something. A choked, involuntary noise left my throat and my knees buckled. I caught myself on the wall, sliding to the dirty tiled floor as the letter fluttered from my numb fingers. This couldn't be happening. He knew my name. He knew where I lived. He had been at the park again, looking for me. I thought of the older hiker's dire warning. There's something very wrong here. An understatement if I ever heard one. Icy tendrils of fear snaked through my veins. I needed help now, before this escalated any further. Pulling out my phone with badly trembling fingers, I dialed 911. The 2 officers who responded to my call did little to ease my skyrocketing anxiety levels. After examining the letter and asking me a series of brusque questions, they exchanged a meaningful look that set my teeth on edge. Their body language screamed hysteria and overreaction. Miss Brennan, the older cop, said slowly, as if speaking to a spooked animal. I understand you're frightened, but from what you've told us, this individual hasn't made any clear threats or done anything overtly illegal. Writing a vaguely unsettling letter isn't a crime. I gaped at him, a slow burn of anger temporarily eclipsing my fear. Vaguely unsettling. He's been stalking me for months. He chased me through the woods with a rope. How is that not a threat? The younger officer held up a placating hand. We're not dismissing your concerns. It's definitely a disturbing pattern of behavior. But you have to understand, there's not a lot we can act on at this stage. I opened my mouth to argue, but he cut me off gently. Here's what we can do. We'll send a car by your place a few times a day to check on things. We'll also have officers stake out the Pinecrest parking lot in case this guy shows up there again. In the meantime, keep your doors locked, be aware of your surroundings, and let us know immediately if you receive any more communications or spot him anywhere around town. Okay? Sensing it was the best I was going to get, I nodded mutely, exhaustion settling into my bones as the adrenaline faded. The officers assured me they'd be in touch, collected the letter as evidence, and left me standing bereft in my empty apartment as shadows gathered outside. That night was one of the longest of my life. I paced, I obsessively checked my locks, I researched restraining orders and self-defense classes. When I did manage to drift off around 3 a.m., curled in the corner of the couch with all the lights blazing, my dreams were fragmented and drenched in dread. I dreamed of being lost in a dark, endless forest, icy rain dripping through a canopy of skeletal branches. There was an awful sense that something was in the woods with me, watching from behind gnarled trunks, waiting for me to let my guard down. I ran until my lungs ached, feet slipping on decaying leaves, always sensing a malignant presence closing in. A flash of beige, the creak of a rope, the cloying scent of mud and blood, and something worse. I woke screaming, ashen dawn light peeking through the blinds and a sour taste in my mouth. Groaning, I buried my face in my hands, digging the heels of my palms against burning eyes. Enough was enough. I couldn't live like this, constantly glancing over my shoulder, wondering if every shadow hid a predator. I had to get out of this apartment, out of this town, even if just for a few days. I needed somewhere safe to clear my head and make a plan. With a flash of inspiration, I grabbed my phone, scrolling until I found the entry for Mom. I hadn't been home to visit my parents in over a year. If I could just get to the quiet of their rural farmhouse a few hours away, maybe I could breathe again. I had no idea that in my desperation to escape one nightmare, I was unwittingly barreling towards something far, far worse. In the grand scheme of what was to come, my faceless stalker would soon be the least of my worries. But in that moment, huddled on my couch, he was the only monster I knew. How naive I was. How foolish. The real horror was waiting for me back home, and its roots ran far deeper than I ever could have imagined. The drive to my parents' farm was uneventful, almost anticlimactic after the unrelenting tension of the past few weeks. I found myself scanning passing cars warily, half expecting to see a dirty blue pickup loom in my rearview mirror, but the highway remained blessedly free of menacing vehicles. With each mile that fell away behind me, I felt the knot between my shoulders loosen infinitesimally. Mom and Dad were surprised but delighted to see me on their doorstep that evening. If they noticed the dark circles under my eyes or the faint tremor in my hands, they were kind enough not to mention it. Over a comforting dinner of pot roast and potatoes, I let the warm thrum of their chatter wash over me, soothing in its blessed mundanity. Later, ensconced in my childhood bedroom, the horrors of Pinecrest felt very far away indeed. Surrounded by the cheerful detritus of my youth, academic trophies, faded boy band posters, stuffed animals gone limp with age and love. It was tempting to believe I had conjured the whole awful affair in a fit of city-induced paranoia. I drifted off to a dreamless sleep, lulled by the familiar creak of the house settling and the distant lowing of cattle. I should have known it was the calm before the storm. The morning dawned clean and crisp, sunlight slanting through the gingham curtains and the aroma of frying bacon wafting up from the kitchen. Stretching languidly, I mentally mapped out a day of pleasant nothingness, coffee on the porch, a long walk around the property, perhaps picking Mom's brain for her famous snickerdoodle recipe. It felt good to inhabit a skin, not perpetually prickled with fear and hypervigilance. Padding downstairs in sock feet, I followed the sound of feminine humming through the house. I found Mom at the stove, aproned and aglow, as she prodded sizzling strips of pork with a fork. She turned, smiling, as I slouched into one of the kitchen chairs. "Morning, sleepyhead," she said, setting a steaming mug of coffee in front of me. "Your father had to run into town for some tractor part, but he'll be back by lunch. I thought we could—" She cut herself off abruptly, her sunny expression fading into one of grandmotherly concern. "Sweetheart, you're white as a sheet." "Is everything okay?" I stared at her, uncomprehending. Then, following her gaze, I looked down to find my hands curled into bloodless claws around a rectangle of newsprint. A short article, accompanied by a grainy black-and-white photo, stood out in stark relief against the faded page. "Local man arrested in connection with Pinecrest stalking," the headline screamed. Beneath it, the photograph, even blurry and indistinct, turned my veins to ice. I knew that doughy face. I knew those flat, empty eyes. In an instant I was back in the woods, breath soaring in my lungs as heavy footsteps crunched closer. The world spun sickeningly and I flew out of my chair, barely making it to the sink before the meager contents of my stomach made a violent reappearance. Mum was at my elbow in an instant, rubbing my back and making soothing noises. Dimly, I registered the shrill ring of the telephone from the living room. Mum squeezed my shoulder and hurried to answer it. Slumping against the counter, I forced myself to focus on the article through vision blurred with tears. Preliminary details were sparse, but the broad strokes painted a chilling picture. The man, identified as 52-year-old Gerald Matheson, had been taken into custody late last night after an off-duty police officer spotted his pickup truck parked at the edge of Pinecrest Conservation Area. Search of the vehicle had uncovered rope, duct tape, and a large hunting knife, as well as several personal items later identified as belonging to previous female stalking victims. Matheson's home contained further damning evidence, including a room dedicated to his apparent obsessions, its walls plastered with candid photos of women on hiking trails and in public parks. The words blurred together as a tidal wave of dizzying relief crashed over me. They had him. The nightmare was over. I was safe. My legs buckled and I slid to the cold linoleum, a hysterical laugh building in my throat. From the next room, the sound of my mother's voice filtered in, unnaturally high and thin, with an emotion I couldn't place. Yes, of course, officer. I understand. We'll be here. Thank you for calling." Footsteps. Then Mom appeared in the doorway, her face ashen. In her hand, she clutched a small stack of glossy photographs. "Mom." My voice sounded alien to my own ears. "What is it?" "What's wrong?" She met my eyes, 2 spots of high color burning in her cheeks. The fingers wrapped around the photos trembled. "Honey," she said, swallowing audibly. "Those police officers in the city, they just sent over some evidence from that man's house. Pictures of places he was watching." With a spike of dread, I suddenly understood what she was trying to say. The question rose to my lips, even as I shrank from the answer. He was watching our farm, wasn't he? Mom closed her eyes briefly as if pained. Then wordlessly, she held out the photographs, fanned like a macabre deck of cards. With numb fingers, I took them, the edges biting into my skin. Image after image of our farm stared back at me, the angles unmistakably taken from the shelter of the scrubby tree line at the property's edge. The barn, the cattle pen, the faded red door of the farmhouse itself. Shot after shot, the focus tightening, zeroing in on my breath seized in my lungs. There, in sickening detail, was a picture window, gingham curtains framing the vista beyond. And at that window, caught in a moment of carefree domestic intimacy, stood my mother. Humming in the kitchen, bacon sizzling on the stove behind her. The scene from not even an hour ago. Horror exploded through my nervous system like a live current, burning and absolute. I looked up at Mom, seeing my own spiraling terror reflected back in her eyes. The farmhouse no longer felt like a haven. It felt like a trap, a flimsy fortress against an evil that had already breached the gates. The safe, cozy realm of my childhood had been brutally violated, tainted with a fear that would linger long after the monster was caged. How long had he been watching us? How much had he seen? The questions felt like ashes on my tongue as a grim truth crystallized in my mind. Our family would forever be looking over our shoulders now, wondering if a new manifestation of this nightmare was lurking just out of sight. Matheson may have been caught, but the scars of his intrusion would be indelible. In trying to outrun my demons, I had unwittingly led them straight to my own doorstep. And now we would all have to learn to sleep with one eye open. The real horror I was discovering was that there were no true safe spaces left. Not anymore. Not for me, not for any of us. The next few days passed in a haze of police interviews, hushed telephone conversations with a victim's advocate, and the acrid tang of fear permeating every corner of the farmhouse. Mom and I jumped at small noises, started at shadows, obsessively checked and rechecked the locks on doors and windows. Overnight, our sprawling property had transformed from bucolic sanctuary to menacing wood, every copse of trees a potential hiding place for unseen eyes. Dad took it the hardest. I'd always seen my father as an unshakable pillar of strength, a gruff but loving patriarch who could weather any storm. To watch him slowly crumble under the weight of his perceived failure as protector of his family was its own unique agony. He retreated into grim silence, spending long hours walking the fence line with a grim set to his jaw and a white-knuckled grip on the shotgun he now carried everywhere. I couldn't help but feel that I had dragged this plague of fear into their lives, a malignant hitchhiker clinging to the undercarriage of my frantic flight to safety. Guilt gnawed at me in quiet moments, insidious whispers that if only I'd been more careful, more vigilant, none of this would have happened. On the fourth night, I woke from a restless sleep to the creak of floorboards in the hallway. Heart pounding, I sat up, straining to listen in the oppressive dark. Another creak, then a soft thump like the scuff of a shoe against wood. Cold sweat prickling along my hairline, I eased out of bed, bare feet whispering against the braided rug. The old aluminum baseball bat from my high school days rested against the wall, within easy reach. I grabbed it, feeling marginally better with the solid weight of metal in my hands. Easing open the bedroom door, I peered into the gloom of the hallway. Nothing moved in the shadows, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood at stubborn attention. Back clenched in a white-knuckled grip, I crept towards the stairs, cursing my wildly thumping heart. It sounded like a war drum in the stillness. At the landing, I risked a glance over the banister, down into the darkened foyer below. My breath caught. The front door stood ajar, a rectangle of deeper black against the night. I knew with absolute certainty that we had locked it before going to bed. Terror turned my limbs to water. He was here. Somehow, impossibly, Matheson had slipped the nets of law enforcement and come to finish what he started. A soft rustle from the direction of the kitchen broke my paralysis. Clenching my jaw against the scream rising in my throat, I crept down the stairs, bat held at the ready. The kitchen doorway yawned ahead, a portal to an abyss. I could hear him in there, the soft, furtive movements of a predator trying not to spook his prey. Rage abruptly burned through the fog of fear. How dare he violate the sanctity of my family's home, the last illusion of safety we had left. Hefting the bat, I lunged through the door, a war cry on my lips, only to falter at the sight of my father's broad back, hunched over the kitchen counter. He whirled at my entrance, a wild look in his eyes, and one hand clutching a wicked filleting knife. For a heartbeat, we stared at each other, chests heaving. Then Dad sagged, the knife clattering to the tiles as his head dropped forward. Christ almighty, girl. I nearly took your head off. Dad. I hated how my voice shook. Why is the front door open? I thought. I couldn't finish the sentence, but I didn't need to. Dad scrubbed a hand over his haggard face. I was checking the perimeter. Thought I heard something out by the tree line. Probably just a damn coyote, but I couldn't chance it. He looked up, ancient eyes in a careworn face. I'm sorry for scaring you, sweetheart. I thought I'd closed the door behind me. Guess I'm just jumping at shadows. Wordlessly, I crossed the kitchen, wrapping my arms around his solid bulk. We stayed like that for a long moment, clinging to the tattered threads of normalcy. What are we going to do, Dad? I whispered into the warm flannel of his nightshirt. He sighed, rubbing my back in slow circles like he used to when I was a child, frightened of the monsters under the bed. If only those monsters were as easy to banish now. We're going to get through this, he said gruffly. One day at a time. It won't be easy, but we're going to reclaim our peace. That bastard doesn't get to win. Not now, not ever. I leaned into him, tears sliding hot and silent down my cheeks. I wanted so desperately to believe him. But deep down, in some small wounded place, I knew that a vital innocence had been lost. Matheson had stolen something precious from us, an intangible sense of sanctuary that could never quite be fully restored. We could rebuild, but the walls would always bear the scars of his trespass. The cracks would whisper of what once was, and we would learn to live with the echoes. For now, the night pressed close, gravid with the ghosts of might-have-beens. In the morning, we would put on our armor and face this brave new world, one where locks and fences and watchful eyes were our new constants. But in that fragile moment, in the bruised shadows of the witching hour, we simply held each other in the dark. A family, fractured but not broken. The monsters were still out there, but for now, we had each other. We could only pray it would be enough. Weeks slid by in a fog of dull exhaustion and grinding hypervigilance. The world moved on, but we remained suspended in the long shadow of Gerald Matheson's intrusion, unable to unshackle ourselves fully from the weight of his malignant watch. I extended my leave of absence from work, unable to bear the thought of returning to my lonely, empty apartment in the city. Matheson himself largely retreated from the headlines in the wake of his arrest, and more boogeymen swallowed by the quicksand maw of the 24-hour news cycle. A few more stalking victims came forward, emboldened by his capture. A trickle of grim details emerged from police sources, painting a portrait of a man consumed by the rotten marrow of his own obsessions. But for the most part, life trundled on without us, a ceaseless river of the mundane and the unremarkable. People woke, worked, ate and slept in blissful anonymity, their traumas small and manageable. A strange, grasping envy burned in my chest when I contemplated the cozy smallness of their lives. What I wouldn't give to shrink my own horrors to an easily swallowed pill, a mild discomfort rather than a yawning void. I walked the farm's perimeter daily, committing each fence post and gnarled oak to memory. The landmarks grounded me, a communion between soul and soil. Here now, inhale. I was safe. He was caged. The monsters of my mind could only stalk me as far as the boundary lines of my resolve. But even as I wrestled the wild country of my own unquiet thoughts into something resembling normalcy, I couldn't shake the sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Call it the paranoia of the prey animal, forever scanning the underbrush for signs of fang and claw. I'd glimpsed the grinning skull beneath the skin of the world, and I would not be caught unawares again. It was nearing dusk on an unremarkable Thursday when the illusion of peace shattered anew. Dad and I were repairing a rotted slat in the cattle pen, hands and faces grimy with honest sweat. The lengthening shadows sketched spindly fingers across the packed dirt, just brushing the toes of Dad's work boots. We straightened in unison at the sound of crunching gravel, a heavy vehicle pulling up the long ribbon of driveway. Shading my eyes, I watched the police cruiser roll to a stop. The dread was a living thing, coiled cold and oily in my belly. In my peripheral vision, I saw Dad's shoulders go rigid, his knuckles whitening on the handle of the hammer. Two officers exited the vehicle, faces somber beneath the brims of their caps. I recognized one of them, the youngish deputy from my first report at the station. His gaze caught mine, and something apologetic flickered across his features. That, more than anything, told me everything I needed to know. When they reached us, caps clutched respectfully to their chests. I wasn't surprised by the news that tumbled from their lips. Nah, maybe, queasy with an odd sense of inevitability. But not surprised. Gerald Matheson was dead, found hanging in his cell not 2 hours ago, a makeshift noose fashioned from a bedsheet. No foul play suspected, just the last act of ultimate control from a man who had made violation his currency in life. The words washed over me, a sonorous hum without meaning. I stared past the shoulders of the officers to the weathered slats of the barn, the blood-red smear of sunset spilling across the hayfield beyond. The world looked the same, but something essential had shifted, a tectonic grind just below the surface. I had thought this day would bring relief, a lancing of the poison that festered in my marrow. But instead, I felt hollowed out, scraped raw and inflamed. Matheson's death was an unsatisfying ending, a cheap twist delivered by an uncaring author. There, in the weeks and months that followed Matheson's death, I slowly began the arduous process of stitching my life back together. It was a patchwork affair, the seams forever twisted and the pattern irrevocably altered. But it was mine, imperfect, hard-won, but undeniably mine. I returned to the city, to my job, to the simple routines that had once seemed so small and stifling. Now I clung to them like a lifeline, grateful for the structure they provided amidst the lingering shadows of trauma. Work was a welcome distraction, a place to pour my fractured focus into something constructive. My co-workers, bless them, never pried, but I caught the worried glances, the gentle attempts to lighten my load. Their quiet support was a balm on my rawest days. Healing was a non-linear thing, I discovered. There were good stretches, days when I moved through the world feeling almost normal, almost whole. I'd laugh at a joke, make small talk with a barista, hum along to a song on the radio, and marvel at the resilience of the human spirit. I was battered, but I was still here, still fighting, still me. But the bad days lurked, waiting to drag me back into the mire when I least expected it. A glimpse of a green coat on a crowded sidewalk, a whiff of damp earth, the creak of a branch in the wind. The most innocuous things could plunge me back into the breathless terror of those moments in the woods. I'd find myself paralyzed, trembling, the scream trapped behind my teeth like a frantic bird. The flashbacks were the worst, vivid and visceral, hijacking my senses until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Therapy helped, even if I spent the first few sessions crying until my throat was raw. Saying the words out loud, giving shape to the formless dread that had dogged me for so long. It was excruciating. But bit by bit, the poison seeped out, the lacerations of my psyche slowly knitting back together. I began to sleep through the night again, to walk down the street without the constant prickle between my shoulder blades. Tiny victories, hard-fought and precious. My relationship with the outdoors remained complicated. I longed for the peace I had once found in nature's embrace, but the fear was a stubborn squatter refusing to vacate the premises. Every rustling leaf sounded like a footstep. Every shadow held a hidden menace. I knew logically that Matheson was gone, that he could never hurt me or anyone else again. But trauma has a way of etching itself into your DNA, an indelible scar that throbs with ghostly pain long after the wound has healed. And so I started small. Walks in the park at midday, always with a friend. Scenic drives through the countryside, windows up and doors locked. Tentative hikes on well-traveled trails, pepper spray tucked into my pocket like a talisman. Each outing was a trial, a test of will and nerve. Some days I passed, striding through the fear with my head held high. Other days I faltered, retreating to the safety of my apartment to lick my wounds and try again tomorrow. Progress was measured in inches, not miles. But I was moving forward, reclaiming the pieces of myself that Matheson had tried to steal. I would not let him win, even from beyond the grave. I would not let him define me. Mom and Dad were pillars of strength, even as they grappled with their own demons. We talked often, leaning on each other from afar, a fragile triangle of support. They were slowly learning to feel safe in their own home again, to trust the silence of the fields and the solidity of the fences. Dad no longer slept with the shotgun by the bed. Mom could look out the kitchen window without flinching. Like me, they were finding their way back, one halting step at a time. We all bore scars, invisible but indelible. Matheson's legacy etched into our hearts and minds. But we were more than the sum of our scars. We were survivors, wounded but unbowed. We would carry on for ourselves and for each other. We would find beauty in the world again. I still think about that November day, the damp chill, the crunch of leaves, the prickling awareness of eyes on my back. It feels like a lifetime ago, a nightmare from which I'm still not quite certain I've awoken. But I'm learning to live in the aftermath, to navigate a reality forever altered by the knowledge of how quickly the ground can crumble beneath your feet. I will never be the same naive woman who walked into those woods, carefree and unafraid. Innocence once lost can never be fully regained. But perhaps there is a strange sort of grace in that loss, a wisdom forged in the crucible of survival. I'm warier now, more attuned to the darkness that lurks in the hearts of men. But I am also more appreciative of the light, more fiercely protective of the simple joys that make life worth living. I still walk in the woods, not as often and never alone, but I refuse to let fear steal the solace of the trees, the whisper of the wind, the dappled dance of sunlight through the leaves. There is danger in the world, yes, monsters waiting in the shadows, but there is also beauty, raw and defiant, riotous with the audacity of its own existence. And so I choose to seek out that beauty, to cling to it with every fiber of my being. I choose to believe that there is more light than darkness, more goodness than evil. I choose to keep walking, one foot in front of the other, out of the woods and into the wide open world. Scarred but whole, battered but unbroken, still here, still fighting, still me. The summer of 2018 brought an opportunity I couldn't resist. At 17, I found myself invited to spend a few weeks at my friend Tom's aunt's farmhouse in rural Nebraska. Tom, a year my senior, had always been the adventurous type, and I knew this trip would be anything but boring. As we pulled up to the old farmhouse, its weathered facade loomed before us. The white paint was peeling, shutters hung askew, and an eerie silence seemed to envelop the property. Dense woods stretched out behind the house, their shadows long and foreboding in the late afternoon light. Tom's Aunt Meredith greeted us at the door, her silver hair neatly pulled back, eyes crinkling with a smile that didn't quite reach them. "Welcome, boys," she said, her voice carrying a hint of, was it concern? "Come on in and get settled." As we lugged our bags up the creaking stairs, Tom filled me in on the property's history. "This place has been in our family since the 1800s, he explained, his voice low. "There are stories, dark stories about what's happened here over the years." I felt a chill run down my spine, despite the summer heat. "What kind of stories?" Tom's eyes darted around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Disappearances, unexplained phenomena. My cousin Becky, she hasn't been the same since she spent a summer here as a kid. Says she saw things in the attic. That night at dinner, Meredith shared more of the property's grim history. One tale in particular stood out. In the early 1900s, she began, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. A family lived deep in those woods. The Millers. One day they vanished without a trace, left everything behind, clothes, furniture, food on the table. No one ever found out what happened to them. Tom and I exchanged glances, a mix of excitement and apprehension passing between us. "Is their house still out there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Meredith's eyes narrowed. "If it is, it's been lost to time. There was an old trail, but it's long overgrown. My father," she paused, swallowing hard, "he made us swear never to go looking for it. Said there was something wrong in that part of the woods, something unnatural." Later that night, as Tom and I prepared for bed, he leaned in close. "We're going to find that house," he whispered, his eyes gleaming with a determination that sent a shiver through me. I nodded, caught up in his enthusiasm despite the growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. That night, sleep evaded me. The old house groaned and shifted, each creak and pop setting my nerves on edge. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. carrying with it sounds that my mind transformed into muffled voices and distant screams. As I lay there, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to step into something far beyond our understanding. The rational part of my brain tried to dismiss these thoughts as products of an overactive imagination, fueled by ghost stories and the unfamiliar surroundings. But deeper down, in a primal part of my psyche I rarely acknowledged, a voice was screaming at me to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. It was a voice I would come to wish I had listened to in the days that followed. As dawn finally broke, casting long shadows across my room, I made a silent promise to myself. Whatever happened, whatever we discovered out there, I would face it head on. I had no idea then just how thoroughly that resolve would be tested. The next morning, Tom and I set out early, determined to find the lost Miller homestead. We packed our backpacks with water, snacks, and basic supplies, telling Meredith we were going for a hike. She eyed us suspiciously, but didn't press the issue. As we entered the woods, the temperature dropped noticeably. The dense canopy overhead blocked out much of the sunlight, casting everything in a greenish gloom. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and unnaturally still. "So, where do we start?" I asked, my voice sounding muffled in the thick air. Tom pulled out an old creased map. "I found this in the attic last night. It's from the 1920s, but it shows some of the old trails. If we can find one, it might lead us to the homestead." We pushed deeper into the forest, keeping an eye out for any sign of an old path. The underbrush was thick, thorny vines catching at our clothes and skin. After what felt like hours of trudging through the dense foliage, we stumbled upon a barely visible trail. "This has to be it," Tom said excitedly, pushing aside a tangle of branches. As we followed the overgrown path, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew taller, their trunks twisted into bizarre shapes. Moss hung from the branches like tattered curtains, and the ground beneath our feet felt spongy and unstable. A sense of unease grew in the pit of my stomach. The woods were eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals. Just the sound of our labored breathing and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. "Tom," I said, my voice tight with anxiety, "something doesn't feel right about this place." He nodded, his earlier excitement replaced by a look of concern. "I know what you mean. It's like the forest is watching us." Just as I was about to suggest turning back, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient, decrepit well. The stones were covered in moss and lichen. The wooden beam that once held a rope and bucket long since rotted away. We approached cautiously, drawn by a morbid curiosity. As we got closer, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. A rusted chain extending from the murky depths of the well, moving slightly as if something was tugging on it from below. "Do you see that?" I whispered, pointing at the chain. Tom nodded, his face pale. "What do you think it's attached to?" Before I could answer, a cold wind whipped through the clearing, carrying with it a foul, rotting stench. The chain began to rattle more forcefully, links clinking against the stone of the well. Overwhelmed by a sense of dread, I grabbed Tom's arm. "We need to leave now." But Tom seemed transfixed by the well. He took a step closer, reaching out towards the chain. "Tom, don't!" I hissed, but it was too late. His fingers closed around the rusted metal, and he gave it a tentative tug. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden jerk, the chain began to rise from the well. Tom's eyes widened in shock. He tried to let go, but his hand seemed fused to the chain. "I can't let go!" he cried, panic rising in his voice. I lunged forward, grabbing him around the waist as the chain continued to rise. Whatever was on the other end was incredibly strong, pulling both of us towards the mouth of the well. My feet slid in the damp earth as I strained against the unseen force. Tom's face was a mask of terror, his free hand clawing at the one gripping the chain. Just when I thought we would both be dragged into the dark depths, the chain went slack. We tumbled backward, landing in a heap on the forest floor. For several long moments we lay there, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding. Slowly, we sat up and stared at the well. The chain hung limply from the opening, both ends visible. There was nothing attached to it. What? What just happened? Tom asked, his voice shaking. I shook my head, unable to form words. The sense of wrongness that permeated the clearing was overwhelming. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. We scrambled to our feet and fled, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the path. Branches whipped at our faces, thorns tore at our clothes. But we didn't slow down until we burst out of the tree line near Tom's aunt's farmhouse. As we stood there, panting and shaking, I knew we had encountered something beyond our understanding. Something ancient and malevolent that lurked in the depths of those woods. We never spoke of that day to anyone else. Who would have believed us? But the memory of that well, and the unseen horror that dwelled within it, has haunted me ever since. Even now, years later, I wake up in cold sweats, the sound of that rattling chain echoing in my dreams. If you ever find yourself in those Nebraska woods and come across an old well, heed my warning. Turn back. Don't touch the chain, and pray that whatever lives down there stays down there. In the days following our terrifying encounter at the well, Tom and I tried to act normal, but the experience had shaken us to our core. We spent most of our time near the farmhouse, jumping at every unexpected sound and peering nervously at the edge of the woods. Meredith seemed to sense that something was wrong. She watched us with worried eyes, often opening her mouth as if to say something before thinking better of it. The tension in the house was palpable, a heavy silence hanging over us all. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the tree line, Tom finally broke our unspoken agreement not to discuss what had happened. "We need to go back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at him in disbelief. "Are you insane? After what happened?" Tom's face was pale, his eyes haunted. "I can't stop thinking about it. What was down there? Why couldn't I let go of the chain? We need answers." I shook my head vehemently. "No way. We're lucky we made it out of there once. I'm not risking it again." But even as I said the words, I knew a part of me was curious too. The incident at the well defied all logical explanation, and my mind kept returning to it, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the well, heard the rattling of that chain. In my dreams, I was back in the clearing, but this time Tom was pulled into the well's depths, his screams echoing as he disappeared into the darkness. I woke with a start, sweat-soaked and gasping for air. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed a figure standing in the corner of my room. My heart nearly stopped. "Tom!" I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure moved closer, and I realized with horror that it wasn't Tom. It was taller, more gaunt, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it neared my bed, I could make out its features in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. Its skin was pale and bloated, as if it had been submerged in water for a long time. Empty eye sockets stared at me, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. Water dripped from its clothing and pooled on the floor. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, as the figure reached out a skeletal hand towards me. Just as its cold, wet fingers were about to touch my face, I jerked awake, this time for real. I sat up, heart pounding, and frantically scanned the room. There was no figure, no puddle of water, just the familiar shadows of furniture and the sound of the wind outside. I stumbled out of bed and down the hall to Tom's room, needing to confirm that he was okay. I found him sitting up in bed, looking as shaken as I felt. "Nightmare?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I nodded, collapsing into the chair by his desk. It was so real. I saw something from the well, I think. Tom's face paled. Me too. It was reaching for me, trying to drag me back. We sat in silence for a long time, both lost in our own thoughts. The encounter at the well had affected us more deeply than we'd realized. It wasn't just a frightening experience. It had tapped into something primal, awakening fears we didn't even know we had. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, Tom spoke again. "We can't ignore this. Whatever's out there, it's not going to leave us alone just because we're trying to forget about it." I knew he was right, but the thought of going back into those woods filled me with dread. "What are you suggesting?" "We need to do some research," Tom said, a determined look in his eye. "Find out more about the history of this place, the Miller family, anything that might explain what we saw." I nodded slowly. Research seemed safe enough, and maybe it would help us make sense of our experience. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Whatever force we had awakened in those woods, it wasn't going to let us go easily. As we made plans to visit the local library and historical society, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were setting foot on a path that would lead us to even greater horrors. The well had been just the beginning, a glimpse into a dark world that existed alongside our own. And now that we had seen it, there was no going back. The next morning we set out for the local library in town. The small building was a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the woods, with its cheerful yellow paint and neatly trimmed flower beds. Inside, the air was cool and dry, filled with the comforting scent of old books. We approached the elderly librarian, Mrs. Hawkins, and explained that we were researching local history, particularly the Miller family. Her friendly smile faltered for a moment, a shadow passing over her face. "The Millers," she repeated, her voice lowered. "That's a name I haven't heard in years. Are you sure that's what you want to look into?" Tom and I exchanged glances. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "We're particularly interested in their disappearance." Mrs. Hawkins sighed heavily. "Well, I suppose it's all ancient history now. Follow me." She led us to a back room filled with dusty archives and yellowed newspapers. "Everything we have on local history from that period is here. But I warn you, boys, some stories are better left in the past." As she left, closing the door behind her, Tom and I dove into our research. Hours passed as we pored over old newspaper clippings, land records, and personal accounts. The story that emerged was far more disturbing than we had anticipated. The Miller family, John, his wife Mary, and their 3 children, had indeed vanished without a trace in 1908, but they weren't the first. Over the decades preceding their disappearance, there had been a string of similar incidents in the area. Families, lone travelers, even entire work crews gone missing in or around the woods. One article from 1887 caught my eye. It described a well digger named Samuel Cobb who had been hired to dig a new well for a farmstead deep in the woods. He returned from the job, a changed man, rambling about voices from the deep and things that should not be. He was found dead a week later, drowned in a puddle barely deep enough to cover his face. "Tom," I said, my voice shaking, "look at this." I showed him a faded photograph accompanying the article. It showed the well Cobb had dug, the same well we had encountered in the woods. Tom's face went pale. "That's impossible. That well looked ancient when we found it." This was dug in 1887. We continued our research, finding more unsettling connections. The land where the well was located had a history long before the Millers. Native American legends spoke of it as a place of power, but also of great danger. Early settlers avoided the area, speaking in hushed tones of strange lights and unexplained disappearances. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the library windows, we came across a journal. It belonged to Mary Miller, donated to the library by a distant relative years after the family's disappearance. The final entry chilled me to the bone. "The voices won't stop. They're coming from the well, calling to us. John says we must go to them. The children are crying, but he says it's the only way. God forgive us for what we're about to do." We sat in stunned silence, the implications of what we'd read sinking in. The Millers hadn't just disappeared. They had willingly gone into that well, drawn by some unimaginable force. "We have to go back," Tom said, his voice barely a whisper. I started to protest, but the words died in my throat. Deep down, I knew he was right. We were already too involved, too connected to what was happening. We couldn't walk away now. As we left the library, the sun had fully set, plunging the town into darkness. The streets were eerily empty, and the shadows seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something had followed us from those woods. Back at the farmhouse, we found Meredith sitting on the porch, her face etched with worry. "Where have you boys been?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. We explained about our research, careful to omit our encounter with the well. As we spoke, Meredith's face grew increasingly pale. "You shouldn't have gone digging into this," she said, her eyes darting nervously to the tree line. "There are things in this world that we're not meant to understand. Things that should be left alone." She stood abruptly, wringing her hands. "Promise me you'll stay away from those woods. Promise me you won't go looking for whatever's out there." We murmured our assent, but the promise felt hollow. We both knew that we were past the point of turning back. That night, as I lay in bed, the wind howled outside my window. In its keening, I could almost make out words, a call, a summons. The well was waiting for us, and somehow I knew that this time we wouldn't be able to escape its pull so easily. Sleep eluded me as I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with the implications of what we'd learned. The Millers, Samuel Cobb, countless others, all drawn to that well by some incomprehensible force. And now it seemed it was our turn. As the first light of dawn began to creep through my window, I made a decision. We would go back to the well, but this time we would be prepared. Whatever lurked in those depths, whatever had been calling to people for generations, we would face it. I only hoped we were ready for what we might find. The next morning, Tom and I prepared for our return to the well. We packed backpacks with flashlights, rope, and other supplies we thought might be useful. I also slipped a small pocket knife into my boot, though I wasn't sure what good it would do against whatever we might encounter. We told Meredith we were going for another hike, ignoring the look of fear that flashed across her face. As we stepped off the porch, she called out to us. "Boys," she said, her voice quavering, "please be careful, and if you hear anything strange out there, anything at all, don't listen to it. Don't follow it. Promise me." We nodded solemnly, the weight of her words settling heavily on our shoulders. As we entered the woods, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The trees loomed over us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. This time we found the path to the well more easily, as if the forest itself was guiding us there. The oppressive silence from our previous visit had been replaced by an unsettling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As we approached the clearing, my heart began to race. The well stood as we had left it, the rusted chain still dangling from its depths. But something felt different. The air around the well seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from pavement on a hot day. Tom and I exchanged nervous glances before approaching. The whispering grew louder as we neared, resolving into words just on the edge of comprehension. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded, his face pale. "It's calling to us." We stood at the edge of the well, peering into its murky depths. The chain swayed gently, though there was no breeze in the clearing. "We need to know what's down there," Tom said, reaching for the rope in his backpack. I grabbed his arm. "Wait, remember what happened last time we touched that chain? We need to be smart about this." We spent the next hour setting up a pulley system with our rope, careful not to touch the rusted chain. All the while, the whispering continued, growing more insistent. Finally, we were ready. Tom volunteered to be lowered into the well first. I helped him secure the rope around his waist, my hands shaking slightly. "If anything feels wrong, anything at all, tell me and I'll pull you up immediately," I said. Tom nodded, his jaw set with determination. Slowly I began to lower him into the well. The whispering grew louder as he descended, and I could see him wincing as if in pain. He had barely disappeared from view when I heard him gasp. "Oh my God," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "You need to see this." I secured the rope and carefully lowered myself into the well. The air grew colder as I descended, and the whispering became a roar in my ears. As my feet touched the bottom, I turned to see what had shocked Tom. the bottom of the well opened into a vast cavern, far larger than should have been possible. Bioluminescent fungi cast an eerie blue glow over everything, and there, scattered across the cavern floor, were bones. Hundreds, maybe thousands of bones, but it wasn't just the quantity that was shocking. Many of the skeletons were misshapen, as if the bones had been twisted and reformed. Some had extra limbs, others had skulls that were unmistakably human in origin, but warped into impossible shapes. "What is this place?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Before Tom could answer, a deep rumbling filled the cavern. The ground beneath our feet began to shift and move. To our horror, we realized that what we had taken for solid rock was actually a mass of writhing, tentacle-like appendages. We scrambled back towards the well shaft, but the tentacles were faster. One wrapped around Tom's ankle, yanking him off his feet. I grabbed his hand, but the strength of the thing pulling him was incredible. "Don't let go!" Tom screamed, his eyes wide with terror. I held on with all my might, feeling my grip starting to slip. The whispering had become a deafening roar, and in it I could now clearly hear words. "Join us. Become one with us. Evolve." With a final desperate heave, I managed to pull Tom free. We clambered up the rope, the tentacles grasping at our feet. As we burst out of the well and into the sunlight, we could hear an inhuman howl of frustration echoing from the depths. We ran without stopping until we reached the farmhouse, collapsing on the porch, gasping for air. Meredith found us there, her face a mask of concern and fear. "You went back, didn't you?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've awakened it. God help us all." As we sat there, trying to process what we had seen and experienced, I realized that our ordeal was far from over. Whatever dwelled in that well, whatever had been calling to people for generations, was now aware of us, and I had a sinking feeling that it wouldn't rest until it had claimed us for its own. The horror we had witnessed in that cavern would haunt my dreams for years to come. But even worse was the knowledge that it was real, that it existed just beneath the surface of our world. And now, whether we wanted to or not, we were a part of it. As the sun set on that terrifying day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had set something in motion, something that would have consequences far beyond anything we could imagine. The well's whispers still echoed in my mind, a promise and a threat. "We are waiting. We are hungry, and you will join us." The days following our terrifying experience in the well were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. Tom and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something had followed us back from that underground cavern. Meredith, sensing our distress, tried to get us to open up about what had happened. But how could we explain the horrors we'd witnessed? The twisted bones, the writhing mass of tentacles, the whispers that seemed to bypass our ears and speak directly to our minds. It was beyond comprehension. One night, about a week after our descent into the well, I woke to the sound of scratching at my window. In the pale moonlight, I saw a dark shape moving outside, its form shifting and undulating in ways that defied natural law. I lay paralyzed in my bed, cold sweat beading on my forehead. As the thing outside continued its relentless scratching, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, that I would scream or go mad, the sound stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard a whisper, as clear as if someone were standing right next to my bed. "We're waiting for you. Come back to us." I must have passed out from sheer terror, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun streamed through my window, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. But the memory of that night visitor lingered, along with the certainty that it hadn't been a dream. I found Tom in the kitchen, his face pale and drawn. One look at him told me he'd experienced something similar. "We need to do something," he said, his voice hoarse. "We can't just sit here and wait for whatever that was to come for us." I nodded, feeling a mix of fear and determination. "But what can we do? Who would even believe us if we told them?" As if in answer to my question, Meredith entered the kitchen. She took one look at our faces and sighed heavily. "I think it's time I told you boys the whole truth," she said, sitting down at the table. about this place, about our family, and about the well. Over the next hour, Meredith revealed a history that shook us to our core. The Marshall family, Tom's ancestors, hadn't just been farmers. They had been guardians, tasked with keeping watch over the well and the entity that dwelled within it. It's ancient, Meredith explained, her eyes distant. Older than humanity itself. It sleeps for long periods, but when it wakes, it hungers. And what it hungers for is us. She went on to describe how, generations ago, the family had discovered a way to appease the entity, to keep it dormant. But the knowledge had been lost over time, as family members died or moved away, refusing to take on the burden of guardianship. I hoped it would stay asleep in my lifetime, Meredith said, her voice breaking. But you boys, you've woken it up, and now we need to find a way to put it back to sleep before it's too late. As Meredith spoke, I felt a weight settling on my shoulders. We had stumbled into something far bigger than ourselves, a cosmic horror that had been waiting patiently beneath our feet for who knows how long. "What can we do?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Meredith stood up, a look of grim determination on her face. "We need to go through the old family records. There might be something there, some clue about how our ancestors managed to subdue this thing. And so began our desperate race against time. We spent days poring over dusty journals, faded photographs, and cryptic notes left by long-dead marshals. All the while, the presence from the well grew stronger. We could feel it pressing against the edges of our minds, calling to us, trying to draw us back. Strange things began happening around the farm. Livestock went missing, only to be found days later, their bodies twisted and malformed. The woods seemed to grow denser, darker, encroaching on the farmhouse as if trying to reclaim it. One evening, as we sat surrounded by piles of documents, Tom suddenly sat up straight, his eyes wide. "I think I've found something," he said, holding up a weathered journal. "It's from my great-great-grandfather. He talks about a ritual, a way to bind the entity back into its slumber." Hope surged through me, but it was quickly tempered by the realization of what we would have to do. The ritual, as described in the journal, required a sacrifice, not of blood or life, but of memory and self. "Whoever performs the ritual," Tom read, his voice shaking, "must offer up a part of themselves, their deepest fears, their most cherished memories. It's the only way to satisfy the entity's hunger without giving it a physical form in our world." We sat in stunned silence, the implications of what we'd discovered sinking in. To save ourselves, to save who knows how many others, one of us would have to make an unimaginable sacrifice. As if sensing our discovery, the entity's presence intensified. The air grew thick and heavy, and that now familiar whisper filled our minds. "Come to us. Join us. Evolve." We looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between us. We knew what had to be done. The next morning dawned grey and cold, an unseasonable chill hanging in the air. Tom and I prepared for what we knew would be our final journey to the well. We packed the necessary items for the ritual, as described in the journal. Candles made from rendered fat, herbs that had been dried in moonlight, and a silver mirror that had been in the Marshall family for generations. Meredith hugged us both tightly before we left, tears in her eyes. "Be careful," she whispered. "And remember, no matter what happens down there, what you see or hear, hold on to who you are." The walk through the woods was different this time. The trees seemed to part before us, creating a clear path to the well. It was as if the entity was inviting us in, eager for what was to come. As we approached the clearing, we could hear the whispers growing louder, more insistent. The air shimmered around the well, reality itself seeming to warp in its presence. We set up the ritual items around the well's edge, our hands shaking as we lit the candles and arranged the herbs. The silver mirror we placed facing the mouth of the well, its surface reflecting the swirling darkness within. "Are you sure about this?" I asked Tom, my voice barely audible over the entity's whispers. He nodded, his face pale but determined. It has to be me. This is my family's legacy, our burden to bear. Before I could argue, Tom began to recite the words from the journal, an ancient language that seemed to resonate with the very air around us. As he spoke, the whispers from the well grew to a fevered pitch, and the ground began to tremble beneath our feet. Suddenly, tentacle-like appendages shot out from the well, wrapping around Tom's arms and legs. He cried out in pain, but continued the ritual, his voice growing stronger with each word. I watched in horror as Tom was slowly pulled towards the well, his body beginning to contort and shift in impossible ways. But his eyes remained clear and focused, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. As the final words of the ritual left his lips, there was a deafening roar from the depths of the well. The tentacles released Tom, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. For a moment, everything was still. Then slowly, the shimmering air around the well began to fade. The whispers quieted, becoming fainter and fainter until they disappeared entirely. I rushed to Tom's side, helping him to sit up. He looked at me, his eyes unfocused. "Did it work?" he asked, his voice weak. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I think so. It's gone quiet. The presence. I can't feel it anymore." Tom smiled faintly, but there was something off about it. Something not quite right. "Tom," I said, a growing sense of unease in my stomach. "Are you okay?" He looked at me, confusion crossing his face. "Tom, is that my name?" My heart sank as I realized the true cost of the ritual. Tom had sacrificed not just his fears or his cherished memories, but his entire sense of self. The person I had known, my best friend, was gone. As we made our way back to the farmhouse, Tom, or the person who had been Tom, looked around with childlike wonder, as if seeing the world for the first time. He had no memory of who he was, of our friendship, of anything that had happened. Meredith broke down when she saw him, understanding immediately what had transpired. We spent the next few days trying to help Tom rebuild some semblance of a life, explaining to him who he was, showing him photos, telling him stories of our childhood. But the Tom I had known was gone, sacrificed to keep an unimaginable horror at bay. And though the entity was dormant once again, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was merely biding its time, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to awaken it. As I prepared to leave the farm and return home, I made a promise to myself. I would find a way to restore Tom's memories, to bring back the friend I had lost. And I would ensure that the horror beneath the well would never awaken again. But even as I made this vow, I could feel the weight of the knowledge I now carried. The understanding that our world was but a thin veneer over unfathomable terrors. And the realization that sometimes the price of keeping those terrors at bay is higher than we could ever imagine. The years following our encounter with the entity in the well were a slow, painful process of adjustment and acceptance. I returned home, but found it impossible to slip back into my old life. How could I focus on school, on mundane teenage concerns, when I knew what lurked just beneath the surface of our reality? I stayed in touch with Meredith, calling regularly to check on Tom's progress. She did her best to help him rebuild a life, creating new memories to replace the ones he had sacrificed. But the Tom I had known was gone, replaced by someone who looked like my friend, but was, in many ways, a stranger. As for me, I threw myself into research, spending countless hours in libraries and online forums, searching for any information about similar entities, about ways to combat them, about the possibility of reversing what had happened to Tom. My parents worried about my new obsession, attributing it to the trauma of the accident, the story we had concocted to explain Tom's condition. It was during one of these late-night research sessions, 3 years after that fateful summer, that I came across something that made my blood run cold. A news article about a small town in Oregon, where several people had gone missing in the woods. The details were vague, but there was mention of strange whispers of people acting oddly before their disappearances. I knew immediately what it meant. There was another well, another entity, and it was waking up. Without hesitation, I packed a bag and booked a ticket to Oregon. I told my parents I was visiting colleges, a lie that came far too easily after years of hiding the truth. As I sat on the plane, staring out at the clouds below, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. I was no longer the naive teenager who had stumbled into cosmic horror that summer. I was harder now, more determined. And I had knowledge, terrible burdensome knowledge, but knowledge nonetheless. I knew I was walking into danger. But I also knew that I couldn't stand by and let what happened to Tom happen to anyone else. Whatever was stirring in those Oregon woods, I would find a way to stop it. As the plane began its descent, I clutched the small silver mirror I had taken from the Marshall farm. It was the only tangible connection I had to what had happened. The only proof that it hadn't all been some elaborate nightmare. I didn't know exactly what I would face in Oregon, but I knew it would be just the beginning. There were more entities out there, more wells, more horrors lurking just out of sight, and someone had to stand against them. As I stepped off the plane into the cool Oregon air, I felt a familiar whisper at the edge of my consciousness. It was calling to me, trying to lure me in, but this time I was ready. This time I knew what I was facing, and this time I wouldn't let it win. It was the summer of 2013 when my friend Nadia and her extended family decided to take a rare trip together to the Sundarbans, a vast mangrove forest and tiger reserve in Bangladesh. Nadia had grown up in the bustling capital city of Dhaka before leaving to study abroad after high school, as had many of her relatives. With family members now scattered across the USA, UK, and UAE, it was unusual for everyone to be back in Bangladesh at the same time. Nadia's father, Imran, the unofficial leader of the clan, seized the opportunity to bring all 23 visiting family members on a special 5-day holiday to this famous national park. He booked an entire resort village and carefully planned out each day's itinerary with a local tour company. After the sensory overload of overcrowded, polluted Dhaka, everyone was excited to immerse themselves in the tranquil wilderness and hopefully catch a glimpse of the elusive Bengal tigers. The first few days went smoothly, as the family enjoyed guided hikes through the dense mangrove forests and boat rides through the winding river channels. The pristine natural beauty was a balm to their city-weary souls. But on the 4th day, an ominous note crept in. The older relatives requested an additional unplanned walk through the forest trails before returning to Dhaka the next morning. Since it was a Thursday afternoon, the Muslim holy day of Friday was about to begin, marking the start of the weekend. Many locals were already winding down. With such short notice, the tour company struggled to find guides. The park recommended having at least 2 armed forest rangers accompany each group for safety from tiger attacks. But the company could only secure a single ranger willing to lead the walk at that hour. Not knowing any better, Nadia's family agreed and eagerly set off on what they believed would be one last invigorating trek through the shadowy Sundarbans. The light was already fading as the group of 23 entered the dense forest, chatting and laughing carelessly. The armed ranger led the way at a brisk pace, with the older family members struggling to keep up right behind him. Without noticing, Nadia and her younger cousins slowly fell behind, too absorbed in animated conversation to see the gap widening between them and the main group. Nadia first felt the low rumble in her stomach, a strange, pulsating sensation that spread up into her chest and throat. She dismissed it as hunger pangs or her sensitive digestion acting up. But then it intensified into an unmistakable vibration that reached her ears, an angry, guttural growl muffled like a caged beast. Whipping her head around, Nadia scanned the darkening undergrowth, but saw nothing amiss in the gathering gloom. "Did you hear that?" she asked her cousins uneasily. They shook their heads, having noticed nothing over their own voices. But a minute later, they all heard it in unison. A deep, menacing snarl swelling into a full-throated roar from some unseen spot in the forest. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble with its force. "Tiger!" Nadia's cousin Farid suddenly screamed. Primal fear seized them as they realized the ranger and rest of the family had disappeared far ahead, out of sight and earshot on the winding trail. They were alone and exposed, with one of the world's largest predators concealed mere feet away in the shadowy foliage, hidden from view but acutely aware of their presence. There was only one thing to do: run. Run as if their lives depended on it, because they did. Sheer adrenaline propelled Nadia and her cousins into a desperate sprint through the darkened forest, chests heaving and pulses pounding in their ears. The trail curved and dipped, roots and vines threatening to snag their ankles and send them sprawling at any moment. Low-hanging branches whipped their faces and arms, but far more terrifying was the thunderous roar of the tiger behind them, rattling the very air in their lungs. They could hear its snarls building in intensity and proximity with each gasping breath, spurring them to pump their burning legs even faster. Nadia's mind reeled as she ran, fragments of facts surfacing from the primal haze of panic. Tigers can sprint 35-40 mph, faster than any human. Their night vision is 6 times keener than ours. This was the tiger's domain, and they were trespassers, hurtling heedlessly through the gathering gloom. If it had chosen to give chase, they stood no chance. The fading light was both a curse and a blessing, perhaps concealing them from the tiger's view, but also obscuring the hazards of the trail. "How far to the ranger?" Nadia's cousin Dahlia panted as she ran doggedly at Nadia's side. "I don't know," Nadia gasped back, not daring to look over her shoulder. They had fallen at least a kilometer behind in their earlier inattention. The dizzying path blurred ahead, no sign of the rest of the group. Were they running the right way still? The tiger's roars seemed to echo from all directions. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Nadia spotted a flicker of light through the dense foliage ahead, the ranger's flashlight beam dancing on the trail. A surge of hope exploded in her chest. "There!" she cried out to the others, driving her aching legs forward with renewed determination. "Ranger, help us!" But the light bobbed steadily away from them, heedless of their dire plight. The ranger couldn't hear their shouts over the distance and noises of the forest. Would they reach him in time before the tiger reached them? The flashlight beam glimmered like a lighthouse to ships lost at sea as Nadia and her cousins crashed desperately through the tangled undergrowth. Thorns and branches tore at their clothes and skin, but they barely felt the sting over the thundering of their hearts. The tiger's roars had grown fractionally fainter behind them, but its presence still pulsed threat with each vibration through the soles of their feet. Was it toying with them, herding them like helpless prey through the forest? Or had it lost interest for now, distracted by some other movement in the underbrush? They couldn't chance slowing to find out. Digging deep for any shred of energy left, they broke from the concealing foliage onto a clearer stretch of trail, the ranger's light tantalizingly close now. The loud voices and laughter of the oblivious family members peppered the air ahead. "Help us!" Nadia screamed again, but her ragged cry barely carried. How could her family be so unaware, so carefree, while she and her cousins had just stared into the fiery eyes of death in the forest behind them? They staggered to a gasping halt behind the startled ranger, collapsing against each other. It was several long moments before Nadia could summon enough breath to rasp out, "Tiger, stalking us in the forest." Immediately, the ranger swung his rifle off his shoulder and stepped protectively in front of the youngsters, aiming it with a steady hand back down the path. Nadia noticed with a pang how very young and slight he looked, dwarfed by the vast wilderness. Could a few bullets really stop a charging 400-pound tiger? The rest of the family crowded around in confusion and growing alarm at the ashen faces of Nadia and the others. Questions pelted the air. What happened? Are you hurt? What's going on? Everyone quiet! Nadia's father Imran demanded, his face pale as he scanned the forest. "Get behind the ranger now!" His usual booming voice quavered on the last word. They clustered in a tight knot as the ranger gestured for silence, straining eyes and ears for any sign of the tiger. The forest lay deathly still, not even a rustle of breeze in the leaves, as if all the creatures were holding their breath, waiting. For what seemed like an eternity, they stood frozen, hearts in their throats. Then a low, rumbling growl shattered the silence, so deep Nadia could feel it in her bones. It built to a shattering roar that rang through the trees and turned their knees to water. It sounded enraged, and very, very close. "Run!" the ranger yelled, jolting them from their paralysis. "To the shelter, go!" He fired a warning shot into the air before turning to sprint after their fleeing figures. They ran blindly, heedlessly, all thought of staying together forgotten, as self-preservation overpowered all. Nadia's lungs seared as if she'd inhaled flames, her muscles screaming with each pounding step. But she embraced the pain, for pain meant she was still alive, still ahead of the tiger. Ahead of her, her father half-dragged her mother, who stumbled on a twisted ankle. Farid had thrown his little sister over his shoulder, her wispy hair streaming behind them like a banner. Dahlia sprinted sure-footed as a deer at Nadia's side, their hands clasped tight, pulling each other along. The ranger brought up the rear, pausing every dozen strides to aim his quavering rifle back at the trees. Mercifully, the crude wooden shelter soon loomed out of the darkness ahead. Little more than a rickety platform on stilts with a thatch roof, it stood about 12 feet off the ground, hopefully just out of a tiger's leaping range. A ladder led up to a trapdoor in the floor. "Up! Everyone up!" Imran bellowed above the din of their crashing flight. He practically flung Nadia's mother up the ladder before turning to bodily lift and shove the rest of the family up the rungs. Nadia waited at the bottom until only she, her father, and the ranger remained on the ground. The tiger's roars were alarmingly loud now, shattering the night air in relentless waves as its fury mounted. Just as Nadia set foot on the bottom rung, a shockingly close snarl ripped from the brush at the forest edge. Two blazing yellow eyes flashed in the shadows, and her blood turned to ice. "Abba!" she screamed as her father wrapped an arm like an iron band around her waist and practically threw her up the ladder to the hands grasping from above. She landed in an ungraceful heap as he clambered frantically after her. The trapdoor slammed shut just as an enormous dark shape came hurtling from the trees in an explosion of claws and fangs and fury. The tiger slammed against the shelter's support posts with all its colossal strength and weight. The platform shuddered under the impact as they all clung to each other in bowel-loosening terror. But the stilts held, and the tiger slid to the ground, snarling in frustration. It began to circle the shelter, glaring up at them with burning eyes between ear-splitting roars. Nadia lost count of how many times it slung itself at the posts, trying to reach them, to drag them down into its lethal jaws. Each impact jolted through the planks like a seismic shock, rattling her bones. Surely the whole structure must splinter apart under the assault and send them tumbling right into death's maw. But slowly, the attacks began to ease, the roars to quiet, until only a low, rumbling growl vibrated up through the boards. The tiger slunk back to the forest edge and melted into the shadows, though Nadia could still feel the weight of its gaze boring into them from the blackness beyond the tree line. Waiting. No one slept a wink that endless night, huddled together in the unstable refuge of the shelter, as unknown creatures rustled and called in the impenetrable dark beyond. Nadia couldn't tell if the tremors that shook her body came from terror or from the chill soaking through her sweat-drenched clothes. The tiger's rank musk hung heavy in her nostrils. The ranger, ashen-faced and tight-lipped, gripped his rifle with white knuckles, never taking his eyes from the forest. When Imran asked in a hoarse whisper if the tiger was likely to return, the man could only shake his head. "I don't know. I've never seen one so bold. We must wait for dawn and backup to come. So they waited, jumping at every snap of a twig, every flutter of leaves in the night breeze. The chilling groans and creaks of the woody planks under them sounded unnervingly like a beast's growl, making their hearts lurch over and over in endless false alarms. Years seemed to pass before the first pale gleam of dawn pried through the dense canopy. No red-gold rays of hope, just a slow, grudging lightening of the gloom. But even that was enough to draw shuddering sighs of relief from the exhausted family. The ranger ventured a brief, piercing whistle, some prearranged signal for help. Before long, they heard the distant puttering of a motor, a boat coming down the mangrove channel. It was the sweetest sound Nadia had ever heard. The ranger aimed his rifle over the platform edge and fired 3 shots in quick succession. An answering volley barked back from the river. Within minutes, the boat pulled up to the channel bank nearest the shelter, disgorging 2 more armed rangers who hastened over and called up to the trapped family. After a hushed conference and some tense reconnaissance of the surrounding brush, they positioned themselves in a wary perimeter and beckoned the family to descend, hearts pounding. They crept down the ladder with agonizing care and made a break for the boat, expecting massive claws to come ripping from the undergrowth at any second. But they piled in without incident, babbling hysterical thanks to the rangers, who promptly shoved off the shore and opened the throttle to speed them away through the winding waterways, back to the resort and safety. Once the immediate shock began to fade, Nadia marveled at how truly lucky they had been. The ranger explained that based on how close the tiger had sounded at first and the strength of the vibrations they had felt, it had likely been crouching no more than 10 meters away from them in the forest. Any tiger that neared to prey would normally have attacked instantly, rather than risk losing the element of surprise. At that distance, it could have easily taken out even an armed ranger before he had time to react. For some inexplicable reason, the creature had hesitated, choosing to stalk them from the shadows rather than striking at once. Perhaps they had startled it, coming upon it unawares. Or maybe, just maybe, this tiger hadn't been quite hungry enough to chance a confrontation with such a large group of humans. Either way, they had been granted a second chance at life that vanishingly few ever received. As the resort dock loomed into view through the mist ahead, Nadia said a silent prayer for the tiger, that it might find the deer or boar it needed, far from the paths where humans walked. For she knew now with terrifying certainty that their realities could never safely overlap. The Sundarbans belonged to the tigers, and she would never set foot in them again. Despite intense protest from her still shaking knees, Nadia managed to disembark the boat under her own power, flanked closely by her ashen-faced cousins. As soon as his own wobbly legs hit the planks of the dock, her father enveloped them all in a crushing embrace. His usual bluff facade crumpled. Over his shoulder, Nadia saw her mother, attempting to marshal the rest of the family, but quickly losing the battle against her own tears. The resort manager came hurrying out to meet them, profuse apologies tumbling from his lips. He had heard about the emergency from the radioed rangers and marshaled his small staff to assist in any way possible. Soon, the shaken family was bundled into their cabins with hot tea and extra blankets, though Nadia doubted she would ever feel warm again. Through the thin plank wall, she heard the muted voices of Imran and the ranger captain as they reconstructed the harrowing events piece by piece. When it came to light that only one ranger had accompanied the family on their fateful walk, the captain was livid. The park regulations require a minimum of 2 armed escorts for any forest excursion, he said sharply, his words clear even through the wall. No exceptions. Your company knows this. The manager sputtered something indistinct, but Imran cut him off. Never mind that now. By the grace of God, we are alive and whole. Let us focus on that and leave this place at once. We've had enough of the Sundarbans for a lifetime. The manager was only too happy to comply, arranging an immediate boat transfer back to the main port to meet their waiting cars. Every rattle of the jeep over the rutted road back to Dhaka was a blessed confirmation of their miraculous escape. In the following days and weeks, The story of their brush with the tiger spread swiftly through the family grapevine, gathering embellishments at each retelling until Nadia hardly recognized it. Some said the beast had come close enough for them to feel its fetid breath, others that it had taken a swipe and missed Farid by mere inches. Only those who had lived it could truly comprehend the life-altering terror of being utterly at the mercy of nature's most formidable predator. Nadia's cousin Dahlia said she still startled awake some nights to phantom tiger growls, heart galloping in the darkness. Farid took to obsessively researching tiger behavior, as if understanding could somehow master his fear, and Nadia found herself staring into space for long minutes, reliving those eternal moments of primal horror, marveling anew at the whims of chance that had spared them. In a way, some fanciful part of her felt almost grateful to the tiger, for in coming so close to losing everything, she had gained a crystalline appreciation for the fierce, fragile wonder of being alive. Never again would she take for granted the simple joy of walking in sunlight, unthreatened, of embracing her loved ones without that gnawing awareness that it could be the last time. That was the tiger's unintended gift, she decided, to illuminate the extraordinary beauty of an ordinary day. And as sensational stories swirled of a movie being made, all dramatic embellishment and CGI tigers, Nadia just smiled to herself. Let the world speculate and mythologize. She would hug her family close, walk gratefully under open skies, and hold the tiger's real truth wordlessly in her heart, where it belonged. A few years later, Nadia was surprised to get a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the line identified himself as a wildlife conservationist working in the Sundarbans, who had heard her story through local channels. He told her that the tiger population was in more dire straits than ever, as human encroachment and climate change degraded their habitat and sent them ranging closer to villages in search of food. Attacks on livestock and humans were rising sharply, sparking retaliatory killings from frightened villagers. It was a vicious, tragic cycle that threatened the survival of one of the world's most magnificent creatures. The conservationist had a radical idea, one that required the cooperation of past attack survivors like Nadia and her family. He wanted them to speak out publicly about their experiences, not to demonize tigers, but to educate local communities about the realities of human-tiger conflict and the critical importance of preserving the Sundarbans. "You survived something few can scarcely imagine," he told Nadia urgently. "You know better than anyone the primal terror of facing that animal on its own turf. But you also know the tigers aren't mindless monsters. They're just adapting to a world we've disrupted. If anyone can convey that to the people living on the front lines, it's those like you who have looked into the tiger's eyes and lived." Nadia hesitated, recalling those paralyzing moments in the forest long ago. The scars might be invisible, but some traumas never truly faded. Was she strong enough to reopen those wounds? To use her pain in service of the very creature who caused it? But then she remembered her strange, humbling gratitude to the tiger that had stalked her, for making her cherish life all the more fiercely for having almost lost it. Perhaps it was time to repay that backhanded favor. Her tiger was surely long dead now, as were most of its kind, hunted or starved out of existence. But maybe, just maybe, she could help save those that remained. It was a tiny drop in an ocean of troubles, but it was something. "I'll do it," she said into the phone, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Tell me what I need to do." And so, with shaking hands and pounding heart, Nadia found herself standing before crowds of anxious villagers and flinty-eyed forest officials, sharing her story not for sensation, but for a fragile chance at change. It never got easier, laying bare those shattering memories to sea of hanging faces. But if her words could make even one person see the tiger through new eyes, as a fellow living being struggling to survive in a world turned hostile, then maybe her old nightmare could weave some new dreams from the tatters of the past. As she stepped down from yet another rickety stage to murmurs and averted eyes, Nadia sent a wry thought winging into the fading wild. Are you satisfied, Tiger? I face my fear for you now, again and again. May it be enough for us both. A sudden breath of cool air sighed through the stuffy room, ruffling the papers on the podium. Nadia shivered, feeling a phantom gaze prickle the back of her neck. Just for an instant, she could have sworn she heard a low, rumbling growl vibrating up through the soles of her feet. But when she turned to look, there was only the distant tree line, shimmering in the haze of gathering dusk. The Sundarbans closed protectively around their secrets and their sorrows, as they had for centuries. Nadia knew she would never breach those shadows again. But if fortune and human wisdom held, perhaps the tigers could yet dance in the mangroves a few seasons more, out of sight but never out of mind. That was the bargain. The balance as tenuous as a single silken thread. It would have to be enough. She turned resolutely back to the waiting crowd and began her story once more. The oppressive heat and humidity of a Mississippi summer day clung to my skin like a damp, suffocating blanket as I made my way across the overgrown field. Tall grass and weeds brushed against my legs with each step, releasing clouds of gnats that swarmed around my face. I swatted them away absently, my mind focused on the task at hand. My name is Sean Callahan, and I've lived in this corner of Mississippi my entire life. The land here is a patchwork of pine forests, marshy wetlands, and fields like this one. Beautiful in its wildness, but unforgiving to those who don't respect its dangers. And one of the greatest dangers these days comes in the form of feral hogs. To an outsider, wild pigs might not sound like much of a threat, but those of us who live here know better. These aren't your typical farm pigs. They're big, mean, and smart. A full-grown boar can weigh over 400 pounds, with razor-sharp tusks capable of gutting a man. They breed like rabbits, destroying crops and native ecosystems alike. The damage they cause runs into the millions each year. That's why I've made it my mission to help control the feral hog population however I can. Today, that meant checking on the large corral trap I'd set up at the edge of my property outside the small town of Purvis. As I neared the trap, I paused to wipe the sweat from my brow, squinting against the harsh glare of the setting sun. The metal walls of the corral gleamed dully in the fading light. Inside, I could see dark shapes moving. We had some visitors. I pulled out my phone, tapping the screen to access the live feed from the camera mounted nearby. Sure enough, there was a small sounder of hogs rooting around inside the corral, gorging themselves on the corn I'd used as bait. I counted quickly. 2 large sows, each with a litter of 5 or 6 piglets, plus 1 juvenile male. A grin spread across my face as I watched them. This was a good haul, one of the best I'd had in months. Once they were all well inside the trap, I tapped another button on my phone. With a loud clang that echoed across the field, the trap doors slammed shut. Gotcha! You muddy bastards, I muttered in satisfaction. The hogs inside began to squeal and snort in alarm, rushing back and forth as they sought an escape. But the walls held firm. They weren't going anywhere. Come morning, I'd take care of them for good. As the adrenaline of a successful catch faded, exhaustion began to set in. It had been a long, hot day, and my bed was calling. I took one last look at the trapped hogs before turning to head back to my cabin. The sky had deepened to a rich indigo, the first stars just becoming visible. A chorus of crickets and frogs filled the night air. It was a perfectly ordinary summer evening in rural Mississippi. I had no way of knowing that in just a few short hours my entire world would be turned upside down. That the terrors I was about to witness would haunt my nightmares for months to come. If I had known what was waiting in the darkness, I never would have set that trap. Never would have unknowingly lured a monster straight to my doorstep, but I didn't know. So I simply trudged home, looking forward to a cold beer and a good night's sleep, blissfully unaware that sleep would not come easily that night, or for many nights thereafter. I jolted awake, sometime in the early hours of the morning, my heart pounding. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had woken me. Then I heard it again, a high-pitched shriek of terror and pain cutting through the quiet night. It took my sleep-addled brain a few seconds to place the sound. When I did, ice flooded my veins. It was coming from the direction of the hog trap. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, squinting against the sudden bright glare of the screen. The notification light was blinking, motion detected at the trap. With trembling fingers, I pulled up the live camera feed. What I saw made my blood run cold. The inside of the trap was chaos. The hogs were in a complete panic, charging back and forth and piling on top of each other in their desperation to escape. But it wasn't their frenzied movements that held my attention. There, prowling around the outside of the trap, was something. At first glance, I thought it must be a bear. We do get black bears in this part of Mississippi occasionally, though they're not common. But as I stared at the screen in growing horror, I realized this was no bear. Its body was vaguely canine in shape, but far larger than any dog or wolf I'd ever seen. It moved with an unnaturally fluid grace on all fours, circling the trap like a shark circling its prey. As it passed in front of the camera, I caught a glimpse of its face. The snout was long and tapering, filled with gleaming teeth. But the eyes were disturbingly human-like in their intelligence. They glowed with an eerie yellow light in the infrared illumination of the camera. A chill ran down my spine as childhood memories came flooding back. I was reminded of an old Goosebumps book I'd read as a kid, The Werewolf of Fever Swamp. The creature on my screen looked exactly how I'd always imagined that fictional monster. But this was no work of fiction. This was terrifyingly, horrifyingly real. As I watched, frozen in shock and disbelief, the creature reared up onto its hind legs. Standing upright, it was easily 8 feet tall. Its front paws, no hands, were tipped with cruel curved claws. With shocking speed and agility, it leapt on top of the 5-foot-high corral walls. The entire structure shook with the impact. For a moment the beast crouched there, its head swiveling as it surveyed the terrified hogs below. Then it sprang down into the trap. What followed was a scene of such horrific carnage that my mind recoils from the memory even now. The screams of the dying hogs filled my ears as the monster tore into them with claw and fang. Blood sprayed across the camera lens, partially obscuring the grisly feast. I wanted desperately to look away, to shut off my phone and pretend this was all some twisted nightmare. But I couldn't tear my eyes from the screen. Some primal part of my hindbrain kept me transfixed, forcing me to bear witness. It was over in minutes. The frantic squealing faded to eerie silence. Slowly, deliberately, the creature turned to face the camera directly. Those intelligent yellow eyes seemed to stare right through the screen, meeting my gaze. A low growl rumbled from its blood-stained muzzle. Then, with preternatural speed and grace, it gathered up the mangled carcasses of the largest hogs and vaulted back over the corral wall. In the blink of an eye, it vanished into the dark forest beyond. I sat there in the darkness of my bedroom, phone clutched in my shaking hands for what felt like hours. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. And yet, eventually I managed to force my trembling fingers to set my phone aside. I stumbled out of bed on unsteady legs, my entire body covered in a cold sweat. Moving on autopilot, I methodically checked every door and window in the cabin, making sure they were securely locked. Then I retrieved my SIG P229 pistol from the gun safe, along with several loaded magazines. I positioned myself on the couch facing the front door, weapon close at hand. Sleep was out of the question. All I could do was wait for dawn, straining my ears for any sound of approach. Starting at every creak of the old cabin's timbers. It was going to be a very long night. The first pale light of dawn found me still sitting rigid on the couch, eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. My hand ached from gripping the pistol so tightly for hours on end. But the night had passed without incident. No sounds of approach. No yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness beyond the windows. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, I began to doubt my own memories of the night before. In the harsh light of day, it all seemed absurd. Werewolves weren't real. I must have dozed off and had some kind of vivid nightmare triggered by too many horror movies. But when I picked up my phone, the evidence was still there. Dried smears of blood partially obscured the camera lens. And though the video feed had timed out hours ago, I knew with grim certainty what I would see if I rewound the footage. I needed to see the trap for myself, needed to know if it had all been real or just a product of an overactive imagination. But the thought of venturing out there alone, unarmed, made my skin crawl with primal fear. In the end, it was nearly noon before I worked up the courage to investigate. I'd spent the morning pacing restlessly, downing cup after cup of strong black coffee in a futile attempt to clear the fog of exhaustion from my mind. Finally, I could bear the uncertainty no longer. I pulled on my boots and grabbed my AR-15 rifle from the gun safe. It was probably overkill for dealing with feral hogs, but after what I'd seen last night, I wasn't taking any chances. I made sure the 30-round magazine was full before slinging the rifle over my shoulder. My trusty SIG found its usual place in my hip holster. The midsummer sun beat down mercilessly as I made my way across the overgrown field toward the trap site. Sweat trickled down my back, but I barely noticed. All my senses were on high alert, scanning for any sign of danger. As I neared the corral, the sickly sweet stench of blood and death assaulted my nostrils. My stomach clenched, and I had to pause for a moment to fight back a wave of nausea. Swallowing hard, I unslung my rifle and clicked off the safety. With agonizing slowness, I crept the final few yards to the trap. My eyes darted constantly from side to side, probing the shadows beneath the trees. My ears strained for any sound of movement. Nothing stirred in the oppressive heat of midday. The only sounds were the incessant drone of cicadas and the pounding of my own pulse in my ears. Finally, I reached the corral and peered inside. The scene that greeted me was even worse than I'd feared. The interior of the trap looked like a slaughterhouse. Blood and viscera coated every surface. Bits of fur and flesh clung to the metal walls. Of the 13 hogs that had been trapped the night before, only scattered bones and scraps remained. I'd seen plenty of gruesome sights in my years of hunting, but nothing like this. This wasn't predation. It was massacre. Fighting down another surge of nausea, I forced myself to examine the trap more closely. Deep gouges marred the metal walls, claw marks far larger than any natural predator could have made. The top rail of one wall was bent and twisted, warped by some incredible force. There was no denying it any longer. What I'd seen last night was real. Horrifyingly, impossibly real. I don't know how long I stood there, staring numbly at the carnage before me. Eventually, I managed to shake off my daze enough to raise the trap walls. Better to let scavengers clean up the mess than leave it to rot in the summer heat. As I finished, the hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stood on end. An overwhelming sense of being watched washed over me. Slowly, I turned to scan the tree line, rifle held at the ready. Nothing moved among the sun-dappled shadows. But I could have sworn I caught a glimpse of something, a flicker of movement, a flash of yellow eyes. Then it was gone. Real or imagined, that was more than enough for me. I beat a hasty retreat back to the relative safety of my cabin. Only when I was inside with the door locked behind me did I allow myself to relax slightly. But as I cleaned my guns and tried to process everything I'd seen, one thought kept running through my mind on repeat. What the hell am I going to do now? The weeks that followed passed in a haze of paranoia and sleepless nights. I found myself jumping at every unexpected sound, startling at shadows in my peripheral vision. More than once, I caught myself obsessively checking and rechecking the locks, peering out windows into the gathering dusk. I tried to convince myself that it had been a one-time occurrence, that whatever that thing was, it had moved on to other hunting grounds. But deep down, I knew better. This was its territory now, and I was an unwelcome intruder. Still, life had to go on. I couldn't spend the rest of my days cowering in fear. So gradually, I forced myself to resume some semblance of my normal routines. I still set traps for the feral hogs, still went about my business on the property. But I was far more cautious now, never venturing out after dark if I could help it. And I was always armed. As the shock of that terrible night began to fade, my natural curiosity reasserted itself. I found myself poring over old folklore books and scouring the internet for any information I could find on werewolves and other cryptids. Most of what I found was clearly fiction or the ramblings of conspiracy theorists. But here and there, I came across accounts that sounded eerily similar to my own experience. A cattle rancher in Texas describing livestock killings far too brutal for any natural predator. A hunter in the Pacific Northwest swearing he'd seen a massive wolf-like creature walking on two legs. Grainy trail cam photos from various parts of the country showing glimpses of something that didn't quite fit any known species. It wasn't much to go on, but it was enough to convince me that I wasn't entirely alone in what I'd witnessed. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't unique to my little corner of Mississippi. That realization brought little comfort. If anything, it only deepened my unease. How long had these creatures been out there hunting in secret? How many other people had encountered them and either not lived to tell the tale or been dismissed as crazy if they did speak up? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how perfect a hunting ground this area was for such a predator. Miles of dense forest and swampland sparsely populated. Plenty of game, including feral hogs that no one would miss. And on the rare occasions when human remains were found in the wilderness, it was all too easy to blame it on alligators or other mundane dangers. It was the perfect setup, really. A monster could hunt here for years without ever being discovered. The thought chilled me to my core, but what could I do about it? I had no proof beyond my own eyes, and a shaky cell phone video that could easily be dismissed as a hoax. If I tried to tell anyone, I'd be laughed out of town, or worse, locked up as a madman. No, for better or worse, I was on my own in this. All I could do was stay vigilant and hope that somehow I could avoid drawing the creature's attention again. Looking back now, I realize how naive that hope was, because, of course, it was only a matter of time before our paths crossed once more. By the time late August rolled around, I had managed to convince myself that the worst was behind me. There had been no further sightings or incidents in the weeks since that awful night. The traps I set caught nothing more dangerous than the usual feral hogs. Slowly, the constant fear began to loosen its grip on me. It was nearing the start of deer season, and I decided it was time to set up my game cameras and feeders. The summer heat had finally started to break, making the work of trudging through the woods more bearable. I chose a promising spot near the edge of a small clearing, far enough from my previous trapping sites that I hoped it would be safe. The old metal feeder creaked as I hauled it into place and secured it to a sturdy oak. I filled it with corn, set the timer, and climbed up into a nearby tree stand to wait. The forest was peaceful in the late afternoon light. Birds called softly to each other in the canopy overhead. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, bringing welcome relief from the lingering humidity. Despite my lingering unease, I found myself relaxing as I settled in to wait for the feeder to activate. About half an hour passed before the quiet was broken by the mechanical whir of the feeder dispersing its first load of corn. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the woods. I held my breath, waiting to see what might emerge. It didn't take long. Within minutes, I heard the telltale grunting and snuffling of approaching hogs. A small group of 5 emerged from the underbrush, making their way cautiously toward the scattered corn. I watched them through my binoculars, assessing their size and age. There were 2 larger sows, probably around 200 pounds each, and 3 younger pigs that looked to be about 6 months old. Not a bad group for culling, I thought to myself. Quietly, I reached for my rifle, only to realize with frustration that I'd left it in my ATV at the edge of the clearing. All I had on me was my SIG P229 pistol. It wasn't ideal for hog hunting, but it would have to do. I slowly drew the pistol from its holster, careful not to make any sudden movements that might spook the hogs. They were fully focused on the corn now, rooting and grunting contentedly. I took aim at the largest sow, steadying my breath as I prepared to fire. That's when everything went to hell. There was a blur of movement at the edge of my vision, so fast I almost thought I'd imagined it. Then something massive and dark erupted from the tree line, moving with impossible speed. Before I could even process what was happening, it was on the hogs. The clearing erupted into chaos, squealing pigs scattering in terror. The thunderous impact of bodies colliding, and over it all, a bone-chilling growl that made my blood run cold. In my shock, I nearly dropped my pistol. I grabbed wildly for a handhold to steady myself, certain I was about to fall from the stand. By the time I'd regained my balance and looked back at the scene below, it was already over. 4 of the hogs had vanished into the underbrush. The 5th, the large sow I'd been aiming at moments before, dangled limply from the jaws of the monster I'd hoped never to see again. It was even more terrifying in the fading daylight than it had been on the grainy nighttime footage. Easily 8 feet tall, standing on its hind legs, corded with muscle beneath matted black fur. The wolf-like head swung toward me, yellow eyes locking onto mine with predatory intelligence. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My pistol hung uselessly at my side, even if I'd had the presence of mind to raise it. I knew it would be utterly ineffective against this beast. Then, with a final rumbling growl, the creature turned and loped back into the forest. The massive hog carcass bounced limply in its jaws as if it weighed nothing at all. In seconds, the monster had vanished from sight, leaving only trampled vegetation and spatters of blood as evidence of its passing. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in shock and terror. It might have been minutes or hours before I finally managed to shake off my paralysis. Moving with robotic stiffness, I climbed down from the stand and stumbled back to my ATV. The ride home passed in a blur. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. One thing was clear, this wasn't a one-time encounter. The creature was still here, still hunting in these woods. And sooner or later, our paths were bound to cross again. As I pulled up to my cabin, the last light was fading from the sky. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me with shaking hands. Sleep was out of the question. I knew I'd be in for another long night of watching and waiting, jumping at every sound from the darkness outside. But as the adrenaline began to fade, one thought kept repeating in my mind, what am I going to do now? How can I possibly protect myself or anyone else from a monster like that? I had no answers. All I knew was that my quiet life in these woods would never be the same again. The weeks that followed my second encounter with the creature were a special kind of hell. Sleep became a luxury I could ill afford, snatched in fitful bursts between long nights of watchful paranoia. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush sent my heart racing. I began to jump at my own shadow. I threw myself into research, poring over every scrap of information I could find on werewolves and other cryptids. Most of it was useless. Clearly fictional accounts or the ramblings of conspiracy theorists. But here and there, I found nuggets that aligned with my own experiences. Sightings of massive wolf-like creatures walking on 2 legs. Livestock killings too brutal for any known predator. Grainy photos and shaky video footage that, while inconclusive, showed glimpses of something that didn't quite fit any known species. It wasn't much to go on, but it was enough to convince me that I wasn't entirely alone in what I'd witnessed. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't unique to my little corner of Mississippi. That realization brought little comfort. If anything, it only deepened my unease. How long had they been out there hunting in secret? How many other people had encountered them and either not lived to tell the tale or been dismissed as crazy if they did speak up? As the initial shock faded, it was replaced by a grim determination. I couldn't just sit back and wait to become this thing's next victim. I had to find a way to protect myself, and if possible to stop it for good. My first step was to fortify my cabin as best I could. I installed heavy-duty locks on all the doors and windows. I set up motion-activated floodlights around the perimeter of the property. I even went so far as to rig up some rudimentary alarms, using fishing line and tin cans, not high-tech. But it might give me a few crucial seconds of warning if something tried to approach. Next, I turned my attention to weaponry. My trusty AR-15 and SIG P229 were fine for dealing with normal threats, but I had a feeling they'd be woefully inadequate against the creature I'd seen. I began to amass an arsenal that would have made a doomsday prepper proud. High-powered rifles, shotguns loaded with custom silver buckshot, more for peace of mind than any real belief in werewolf lore. Even a few homemade explosives cobbled together from my days in the military. But deep down, I knew that all the guns and fortifications in the world might not be enough. This thing was faster, stronger, and far more cunning than any normal animal. If it really wanted to get to me, I had little doubt that it could. So I began to formulate a plan. A desperate, possibly suicidal plan, but the only one I could see that might give me a fighting chance. I would set a trap. Not for hogs this time, but for the monster itself. It took weeks of preparation. I chose a spot deep in the woods, far from any hiking trails or campsites where innocents might stumble into danger. I constructed a reinforced cage, much like my hog traps, but on a much larger scale. The bars were thick steel, the joints welded and re-welded until I was sure they could withstand immense force. Inside, I placed a lure, the carcass of a large hog, freshly killed and bleeding. The scent would carry for miles in the still night air. Round the perimeter of the cage, I set up a series of triggered explosive charges. Not enough to kill the creature outright. I doubted anything short of a direct hit from an artillery shell could manage that. But hopefully enough to stun and disorient it long enough for me to act. And then I waited. Night after night, I kept vigil from a nearby blind, rifle at the ready. The hours crawled by, each rustle of leaves sending a jolt of adrenaline through my system. But for days nothing came. The hog carcass rotted, drawing clouds of flies, but nothing more dangerous. I began to wonder if I'd overestimated my ability to outthink this creature. Or worse, if it had somehow sensed the trap and was even now circling around behind me, preparing to strike. It was nearing dawn on the fifth night when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. My hands tightened on my rifle as I peered out into the pre-dawn gloom. There, a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing. I held my breath, hardly daring to move, as the massive shape detached itself from the shadows. It was even larger than I remembered, easily 8 feet tall as it loped on all fours toward the cage. In the dim light, I could make out the corded muscles rippling beneath its matted black fur. Its eyes glowed an eerie yellow as it scented the air, lips pulling back from dagger-like fangs. For a moment, it circled the cage warily. I could almost see the gears turning in its too intelligent gaze as it assessed the situation. My finger tightened on the trigger, ready to detonate the charges the moment it made its move. But I had underestimated its cunning once again. Instead of entering the cage, it reared up onto its hind legs, easily reaching the top of the 10-foot-high structure. With a casual swipe of its massive clawed hand, it ripped the top panel clean off. I cursed under my breath. This wasn't how it was supposed to go, but I couldn't afford to hesitate. I squeezed the trigger, sending the detonation signal to the explosives. The night erupted in fire and thunder. The concussive force knocked me back against the wall of the blind, my ears ringing. Through watering eyes, I saw the creature stagger, clearly disoriented by the blast. This was my chance. I burst from the blind, rifle raised. The creature's head snapped toward me, those terrible yellow eyes focusing with predatory intensity. Time seemed to slow as we faced each other across the smoldering clearing. I knew in that moment that everything hung in the balance. My life, the lives of who knew how many future victims, it all came down to what happened in the next few seconds. I took a deep breath, steadied my aim, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report shattered the pre-dawn stillness. In the same instant, the creature launched itself toward me with terrifying speed. I had time for 2 more shots before it closed the distance, both finding their mark, but seeming to have little effect. Then it was on me. The impact knocked me flat on my back, driving the air from my lungs. Claws raked across my chest, shredding my jacket and drawing blood. Fetid breath washed over me as jaws snapped inches from my face. It was only blind instinct and luck that let me get my rifle up in time, jamming the barrel into the creature's mouth. For a moment we were locked in a desperate struggle. My arms trembled with the effort of holding back its enormous strength. Those alien yellow eyes bored into mine with cold intelligence and murderous rage. I knew that the instant my strength failed, I was dead. With the last of my flagging strength, I managed to work my finger to the trigger. I squeezed, praying that the point-blank shot would be enough. The creature's head snapped back as the round tore through the roof of its mouth. It reared up with an earth-shaking roar of pain and fury. But incredibly, terrifyingly, it didn't go down. I scrambled backward, fumbling for the pistol at my hip. The monster shook its head, blood and saliva flying. Then its gaze locked onto me once more, somehow even more enraged than before. What happened next is a blur in my memory. I emptied my pistol into the creature's chest as it charged. I rolled desperately to avoid its slashing claws. Somehow, I found myself on my feet again, running full tilt through the woods, with the sound of pursuit crashing behind me. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned, branches whipped at my face, but terror drove me onward. Eventually, I burst out of the tree line near my cabin. I sprinted the final yards, practically falling through the door and slamming it behind me. For long minutes I stood there gasping for breath, ears straining for any sound of approach. But there was only silence. As the adrenaline faded, the pain hit me. My chest was a mass of burning lines where the creature's claws had raked me. I was covered in 100 small cuts and bruises from my mad dash through the woods. But I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I had survived. I spent the rest of that day in a daze, mechanically cleaning and bandaging my wounds. My mind kept replaying the encounter, trying to make sense of what had happened. How had the creature survived multiple point-blank gunshots? What would it take to actually kill one of these things? And most pressingly, would it be back to finish what it started? I got my answer 3 nights later. I was dozing fitfully in my chair, shotgun across my lap, when a sound jolted me fully awake. A low, rumbling growl coming from just outside the cabin. Then a heavy impact against the door, making the whole structure shudder. It was back. And this time, it wasn't going to let me escape. What followed was the longest night of my life. The creature circled the cabin for hours, testing every entrance, sometimes battering against the walls with bone-jarring force. I moved from room to room, shotgun at the ready, praying that my fortifications would hold. Several times, I heard the sound of splintering wood, only for the assault to move to a different part of the cabin before it could break through entirely. It was toying with me, I realized, like a cat playing with a mouse before the kill. As dawn approached, the attacks grew more frenzied. The thing howled in frustration, a sound that chilled me to my very soul. The door began to splinter under repeated impacts. I knew it was only a matter of time before it broke through. In desperation, I turned to my last resort. I had rigged the cabin with a rudimentary fire suppression system, using pressurized tanks of a chemical fire retardant. It wasn't intended as a weapon, but it was all I had left. As the door finally gave way with a thunderous crack, I hit the release. The cabin filled instantly with a choking white fog. I heard the creature roar in confusion and pain as the chemicals seared its eyes and lungs. Taking advantage of its momentary disorientation, I dove through the shattered doorway. I rolled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. I could hear it crashing after me, but its movements sounded erratic, uncoordinated. I reached my truck and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. Just as the engine roared to life, something slammed into the side of the vehicle with tremendous force. The passenger window exploded inward in a shower of glass. I stomped on the gas, tires spinning in the gravel before finding purchase. As I fishtailed onto the road, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of a massive dark shape receding into the distance. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between myself and the cabin as I could. It wasn't until the sun was high in the sky that I finally allowed myself to stop, pulling over at a rest area somewhere in Alabama. As the adrenaline faded, the full weight of what had happened crashed down on me. I had lost everything, my home, my livelihood, any sense of safety I'd ever had. But I was alive, and I knew now beyond any shadow of a doubt that the creature was real. More than that, I knew it could be hurt. It wasn't invincible, and that meant somehow there had to be a way to stop it for good. I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing as I tried to process everything that had happened. Finally, I pulled out my phone and made a call to the one person I thought might be able to help, an old army buddy who had connections in some secretive government agencies. As the phone rang, I steeled myself for what was to come. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But next time, I would be ready. It's been 6 months since that harrowing night. 6 months of running, hiding, and preparing. My old army buddy came through, putting me in touch with a shadowy group that officially doesn't exist. They had heard whispers of creatures like the one I encountered, a whole species of them, in fact, living and hunting in secret across the country. They offered me a choice: walk away and try to forget everything I'd seen, or join them in their clandestine war against these monsters. It wasn't really a choice at all. I couldn't just go back to a normal life, not knowing what was out there. So now, I find myself part of a team of hunters, tracking these creatures across the country. We're a motley crew, ex-military, former law enforcement, even a few scientists studying the biology of these impossible beings. We're better equipped now, with specialized weapons and tactics developed through hard-won experience. But it's not enough. For every creature we manage to take down, 2 more seem to appear. They're smart, adaptable, and utterly ruthless. More than once, we've arrived at a scene of carnage just hours too late to save the victims. Every summer when I was a kid, my family made the long trek from our home in Oregon to visit relatives on their farm in rural Iowa. It was a grueling 3-day road trip, cooped up in the backseat of our old station wagon. But I always looked forward to exploring my aunt and uncle's sprawling farm, Willow Grove, with my cousins Abby and Caleb. The farmhouse at Willow Grove was over 150 years old. It had been in my uncle's family for generations. Abby, Caleb, and I spent countless hours investigating every corner of that ancient house and property during our summer visits. We'd climb up into the dusty rafters of the big red barn, daring each other to walk across the rickety boards. We poked through the old abandoned farm equipment and rusted junk in the overgrown fields. On rainy days, we explored the dark, dank cellar, scaring ourselves silly, imagining what might be lurking down there in the shadows. Most of all, I loved the sense of history and family roots that permeated Willow Grove Farm. Even though we lived states away now, coming back to the farm made me feel connected to my ancestors and family heritage. Our rituals and adventures there each summer were a treasured constant in my childhood. That is, until the summer I turned 13. My dad threw out his back that year, and we had to cancel our trip. I was devastated to miss my annual visit. By the time we finally made it back to Willow Grove the next summer, I was 14, mired in adolescent angst and determined to put childish things behind me. That first day back, as Abby chattered on about exploring the barn loft, I rolled my eyes. "That's kid stuff," I scoffed. "Don't you have anything better to do around here?" "Well," Abby lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "there is one place we've never explored." Caleb found an old, forgotten cemetery way out past the north pasture. My curiosity was instantly piqued. A hidden graveyard? That had potential. Perhaps this summer at the farm wouldn't be so lame after all. We set out early the next morning, packing sandwiches and snacks for the day-long expedition. Caleb, 2 years older than me at 16, led the way across the fields and through dense stretches of forest. We hiked for hours under the hot July sun. "Are you sure you know where you're going?" I asked, swatting at a pesky fly. My legs were starting to feel like rubber. "Course I do," Caleb called over his shoulder. "Me and Tommy Albertson found it last fall, hunting for coons. It's just over this next rise." We trudged up a steep embankment, thorny underbrush snagging at our clothes. Finally, we reached the top of the ridge. My heart raced with anticipation. "There," Caleb pointed to a small clearing ringed by dense thickets and sheltered beneath the branches of an enormous gnarled oak tree. "That's Albertson's cemetery." Slowly, almost reverently, we approached the burial ground. Roughly a dozen ancient weathered headstones poked up from the overgrown grass and weeds. A crumbling low stone wall enclosed the small plot. Abby knelt down to examine one of the lichen-covered markers. "Wow, this dates back to 1843! And look, they all have the same last name. The Albertsons must have been one of the first families to settle in this area." A strange heaviness settled over me as I wandered among the old graves. The people buried here had been dead for well over a century. I couldn't explain it, but I had the oddest feeling that we were disturbing their rest, that our presence here was somehow unwelcome. A shiver ran through me despite the muggy heat. "Hey guys, look at this," Caleb called. He was crouched down in front of a row of 7 small headstones near the back wall. "These are all kids' graves. Says they died in 1861, from cholera, most like." I stared at the little lambs carved into the stones, one for each lost child. As old as they were, the grief of those parents felt raw and real to me across the ages. Suddenly, intruding on this place didn't seem like such an adventure anymore. All I could think about was the unspeakable pain this family had endured. "Come on," I said abruptly. "We should get back. It'll be dark soon." Caleb looked at me quizzically but shrugged. "All right, if you say so." We gathered up our things and retraced our steps back across the fields in somber silence, the sun sinking low on the horizon. It felt different from our light-hearted hike that morning. I couldn't shake a deep uneasiness, a sorrow that clung to me like a shroud. That night after supper, we sat around the kitchen table playing cards, but my mind was miles away, lost in melancholy. The tick of the old grandfather clock echoed loudly in the quiet room. Abby suggested we watch a movie, but I begged off, feigning tiredness from our long hike. In truth, I just wanted to be alone with my unsettled thoughts. I trudged up the narrow wooden staircase to the bedroom under the eaves that we cousins shared. Moonlight seeped in through the curtains, casting long shadows across the quilt. The branches of the oak tree in the yard scraped against the window panes. I lay staring at the ceiling, unable to drift off, haunted by the images of those sad little headstones. A loud bang jolted me upright. For a split second I thought it was a gunshot. Then another resounding boom rattled the window. Summer thunder, that's all it was. My heartbeat slowed, but something still felt off. An odd heaviness permeated the warm night air, a thickness that made it hard to breathe. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound from downstairs, a muffled thump, then the unmistakable creak of a floorboard. I sat up, straining to listen. There it was again, the groan of old wood bearing weight, footsteps, slow, shuffling footsteps in the hall below. I leapt out of bed and raced to lock the door, hands shaking. My mind raced through the possibilities, a burglar, a drifter, an escaped convict. There had been rumors of a prison break in Des Moines. "Abby," I hissed. "Abby, wake up!" My cousin sat up groggily, rubbing her eyes. What's going on?" "Shh, listen." I held my breath. Abby's eyes went wide as she heard the unmistakable sound of feet treading down the hall, drawing closer. "Oh my God, there's someone in the house!" Her voice trembled with fear. I grabbed the heavy battery-powered lantern from the nightstand, ready to use it as a weapon if needed. The footsteps paused right outside our door. Abby clapped her hand over her mouth to stifle a whimper. We stared at the door in mute terror, hardly daring to breathe. An eternity seemed to pass. Then the shuffling steps slowly receded back down the hallway. Abby exhaled shakily. What the hell was that? You think we should wake up Mom and Dad? I thought about it for a long moment. No, we can't. They'll think we're crazy, or that we imagined it. I know what I heard, Abby insisted. So did I, but what could we even say that we heard spooky sounds? They'll just laugh it off. Let's wait until morning. Maybe things will make more sense then. My cousin looked far from convinced, but she nodded. We pushed the dresser in front of the locked door and left the lantern burning. But I don't think either of us slept a wink that night. At breakfast, groggy and jumpy from our uneasy vigil, Abby and I kept exchanging furtive glances. I cleared my throat, working up the nerve to say something to my aunt and uncle about what we'd heard. But every time I opened my mouth, the words died on my lips. It all sounded so absurd in the light of day. What's the matter with you two? Uncle Jim asked, eyeing us over his coffee mug. You look like something the cat dragged in. Oh, we just stayed up late watching scary movies, I improvised lamely. Aunt Karen tisked in disapproval, but the subject was dropped. After we finished the breakfast dishes, Abby pulled me aside. I think we should tell Caleb about last night, she whispered. I sighed but agreed. If nothing else, our older cousin might have an idea what to do. We found Caleb in the old barn, replacing a rotted floorboard. He saw our faces and frowned. What's up with you two? The story came tumbling out, the eerie footsteps, our certainty that someone had been right outside our bedroom, the long night spent listening for any other signs of an intruder. Caleb's frown deepened as we talked. He set down his hammer. You didn't hear nothing, he said flatly. Them old floors creak all the time. It was probably just the house settling. We know what we heard. Abby cried. It wasn't the damn house, Caleb. There was someone in there with us. Our cousin rubbed the back of his neck, considering. All right, let's say I believe you. You think maybe it could have been, something to do with that old cemetery we messed with yesterday? I swallowed hard. The thought had absolutely crossed my mind. I'd felt such a deep unease as soon as we set foot in that forgotten graveyard. The grief and loss still echoed across the years. And now this, but ghosts. That was crazy, wasn't it? No way, I said more firmly than I felt. Ghosts aren't real. It had to be something else. Caleb held up his hands. Hey, I'm just saying. You go poking around in a place like that, sometimes you stir up things best left alone, that's all. Abby shivered, despite the heat. So what do we do? Tonight we watch, Caleb said grimly. All of us. And we find out if there's something in Grandma's house that shouldn't be. That night, the three of us lay tensely in our beds, too keyed up to sleep. Outside, heat lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the cornfields in strobing flashes. Maybe it really was nothing, Abby whispered after a while. Maybe Caleb's right and we just let our imaginations run wild. Then we heard it. The slow, deliberate tread of footsteps climbing the stairs. My heart hammered against my ribcage. This was no trick of the mind. Something was coming. The footsteps reached the landing. Floorboards creaked under plodding weight. Closer, closer. Caleb slid out of bed, motioning for us to stay put. He crept to the door and grasped the handle. I bit my tongue to keep from crying out. My cousin took a deep breath and yanked open the door. The hallway was empty. Caleb sagged with relief. There's nothing. A blood-curdling scream cut him off. It was Aunt Karen. More shouts erupted from my aunt and uncle's bedroom, followed by a splintering crash. We tore out of the room and down the hall. Uncle Jim staggered out of the bedroom in his underwear, pale and wild-eyed. "Something's in there," he gasped. "Something knocked me clear out of the bed." Caleb pushed past him into the room, only to stumble back out a second later, face drained of color. "Oh, Jesus," he choked out. "Oh, God, you gotta see this." Trembling, hardly daring to breathe, Abby and I peered around the doorframe. Muddy children's footprints covered the floor, dozens of them small and bare. They tracked across the braided rag rug, up the wall, even across the ceiling, as if gravity held no sway over whatever had left them. My aunt was crumpled on the floor, sobbing into her hands. The antique armoire that had stood in the corner for generations lay in pieces, smashed to kindling. It looked like it had exploded from within. Icy horror flooded my veins as I stared at the wreckage, the eerie footprints. There was no rational explanation. No human child had done this. No living soul had trespassed in the farmhouse. That much was clear now. We had awoken something in that graveyard. Something ancient and vengeful and unspeakably sad. And now it had followed us home. The rest of the night passed in a daze of fear and confusion. My aunt and uncle hastily packed up the car, throwing in clothes and valuables haphazardly. "We're leaving," Uncle Jim said shortly. "Tonight. You kids too. Go get your things." Pale and shaken, we complied without question. Within an hour, we were peeling out of the farmyard. Tires throwing up gravel, putting as much distance as we could between us and the ghastly scene we'd left behind. We drove through the night, not stopping until we reached Des Moines around dawn. Uncle Jim checked us into a motel and promptly passed out from exhaustion. I lay on the sagging mattress, mind racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. Caleb was avoiding my eyes. Guilt and dread knotted in my stomach. I couldn't stop thinking about those poor little graves, the lambs, the unspeakable loss. The pain we'd carelessly disturbed, and now something had followed us from that place, attached itself to us. The horror at the farmhouse proved it. Abby was huddled on the other bed, hugging her knees to her chest. She looked so small and scared. I went and put my arm around her. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we'll figure it out. We have to. We did this, Abby. We need to make it right somehow." My cousin stared at me. How? How do we make something like this right? We don't even understand what it is." She was right. We were in so far over our heads. I felt the hopelessness of it settle in my chest like a stone, but we couldn't run forever. And the thought of that presence attached to our family, our home, was unbearable. Those lost, restless spirits, we'd disturbed them, angered them. And I knew, with sickening certainty, they would never leave us be. Not without some kind of resolution. I'm not sure where the idea came from. Maybe I'd read too many ghost stories. But as I lay there, sick with dread and guilt, a plan started to form. "We have to go back," I said quietly. "To the cemetery, tonight. We have to face this head on, try to put those spirits to rest once and for all." Abby looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Are you insane? No way am I going back there. What choice do we have? You want to live in fear, looking over our shoulders forever? We started this, Ab. We have to finish it." My cousin swallowed hard. I could see the wheels turning in her head. The temptation to just keep running, battling with her sense of decency, and her desire to see her home safe again. "We can't tell Mom and Dad," she said at last. "They'd never let us." "We won't," I agreed. "This is something we need to do ourselves. For our family. For those kids." Abby met my eyes and gave a shaky nod. Caleb muttered a curse. "Y'all are crazy, but I'm in. No way am I letting you do this alone." A surge of love and gratitude for my cousins washed over me. At least I wouldn't be facing this nightmare by myself. We were in it together, for better or worse, and so we waited for night to fall once again. One way or another, this ended tonight. We would put the dead to rest, or die trying. The old cemetery looked different in the eerie half-light of dusk. Shadows pooled under the gnarled oak, obscuring the weathered gravestones. Even the summer breeze felt colder, sharper. The back of my neck prickled. "I don't like this," Abby whispered, echoing my own misgivings. "It feels wrong." "I know," I said grimly, "but we have to try. We can't let this continue." With shaking hands, I clicked on the heavy flashlight and stepped into the burial ground. The crunch of dry leaves under my sneakers sounded unnaturally loud in the breathless hush. Caleb and Abby flanked me as we made our way to the back corner, where the children's graves lay. The little lambs stared at us sorrowfully in the dancing beam of the flashlight. A lump formed in my throat. Kneeling down on the cool earth, I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. We're sorry," I began haltingly. "We never meant to disturb your rest. Please forgive us. We only want to help." The bulb sputtered and died, plunging us into shadow. Abby yelped. In the sudden darkness, the air grew thick, charged with an unseen energy. Goosebumps rippled across my arms. Then we heard it. the low, mournful keen of a child weeping. It swelled and multiplied, the sobs of inconsolable grief eddying around us like a black tide. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to block the terrible sound. The wailing reached a fever pitch, and the ground beneath us began to tremble. Clods of dirt sprayed into the air as something pushed up from below, fighting its way to the surface. Small white hands clawed through the soil. I screamed. Abby was screaming too, a high animal sound of terror. We stumbled back as more and more dirt shifted, the telltale lumps of bodies emerging from the graves. The children, oh God, the lost children, more than just bones now, but horrible mockeries of life, dragged themselves out of the earth. Their eyes were black pits, mouths yawning in silent, endless screams. They lurched toward us, rotted hands outstretched. I think I must have fainted. The next thing I knew, I was being half-carried, half-dragged between Caleb and Abby. Branches whipped my face as we crashed through the woods in blind panic. Behind us, the awful wailing spiraled through the trees. We ran until the sound faded and our lungs burned. At last, we collapsed at the edge of a field, shaking and crying. The horror of what we'd seen was incomprehensible. It's not enough, Abby sobbed. Saying sorry. It's not enough. They need justice, I finished hollowly. They want justice for what happened to them. I thought of the matching names on the headstones. The same dates, the tiny graves, all in a row. In my mind's eye, I saw it play out, a sickness sweeping through the farm. A desperate family sequestered together. The children falling ill one by one, growing weaker, until finally succumbing. Only it hadn't ended there, had it? That kind of anguish, that much sorrow and pain in one place, it left a mark, a wound that festered. And now those spirits were lashing out, demanding restitution for their suffering. But what could we possibly do to ease a grief so great? The question hung between us, heavy with dread. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice rasping. We gotta tell someone. This ain't something a bunch of kids can handle alone. He was right. As much as it terrified me, we needed help. Adult help. Let's go to the sheriff's office, I decided. We'll tell them everything. They can contact, I don't know, paranormal experts, ghost hunters. There's gotta be people who know how to deal with this stuff. We looked at each other grimly. Our only plan, our last hope. Slowly, unsteadily, we got to our feet and began stumbling back through the dark fields toward town. No one, of course, believed us. Not at first. The sheriff exchanged dubious looks with his deputies as we babbled out our story. I couldn't blame them. It sounded crazy even to my own ears. But then they saw how truly terrified we were. How haunted. Something in our faces, our voices, must have convinced them we weren't lying or delusional. All right, just sit tight a minute, the sheriff sighed, scrubbing a hand over his face. He disappeared into his office, no doubt Googling what to do about child ghost uprisings or some such. It was a blur after that. Phone calls were made. Grim-faced men in ill-fitting suits descended on Willow Grove. State troopers, paranormal investigators, even a priest. Our parents were summoned back from Des Moines, ashen and disbelieving. For 3 days, the farm was turned upside down. Every inch was scoured, examined, blessed, and exorcised. Caleb, Abby, and I were questioned relentlessly. It was a waking nightmare, but not nearly as terrible as the thought of what might happen if the angry spirits weren't appeased. Finally, on the 4th day, a hush fell over Willow Grove. The last of the ghost hunters packed up their gear and left, offering no explanations. I cornered the sheriff as he was climbing into his squad car. Is it over?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. The sheriff hesitated, his eyes hooded. "We've done all we can, son. The rest is up to God and those poor children."